The allure of Atlantis is timeless, isn't it? The very name whispers of a lost world of impossible sophistication, a continent of gold and gleaming cities swallowed by the sea in a single, terrible day and night. Plato tells us of its circular canals, its powerful navy, its hubris that angered the gods. For centuries, explorers and dreamers have scanned the ocean floor, searching for any trace of this perfect society, this grand origin story that seems to float just beyond the edge of our own history. The idea that such a magnificent civilization could simply vanish is a chilling and captivating thought, a ghost that haunts our collective memory. It speaks to our deep-seated desire to believe that we are the inheritors of something truly great, something that was lost and might one day be found. It's a mystery that feels almost personal, a blank page in the human story that we ache to fill in. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. Go ahead and post it in the comments. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel. While the physical reality of Plato's island remains a mystery, the quest for it points us toward an even deeper truth: that Europe is littered with the ghosts of lost worlds, real civilizations that rose, flourished, and fell into silence long before the first words of history were written down. Our story tonight begins not with searching for one mythical lost city, but with uncovering the dawn of an entire continent, a time when the very first foundations of what we call Europe were being laid, not in gold and advanced technology, but in earth and wood and colossal stones. Let's drift back, far beyond the reach of any text, past the Romans, past the Greeks, to a time when the last great sheets of ice were in retreat. Imagine a Europe around 10,000 BC. It is not the familiar patchwork of fields and cities we know today. It is a vast, primeval wilderness, a place of immense forests teeming with deer and boar, of windswept tundra where the last mammoths still roam, and of cold, clear rivers snaking their way to the sea. And scattered thinly across this immense landscape are our ancestors. They are small bands of hunter-gatherers, masters of their environment, living a life that had remained fundamentally unchanged for millennia. Their existence is a constant, rhythmic dance with the seasons, following the herds, knowing the secret language of the plants, the tracks of the beasts, the signs in the sky. Their world is immediate, sensory, and perilous. Every day is a search for food, for shelter, for safety. They carry their world with them, their flint tools, their animal skin clothes, their sacred knowledge passed down through spoken word and cave paintings that flicker in the firelight. They are a part of the landscape, not its master. But something is coming. It is not a sudden invasion or a cataclysmic event, but a slow, quiet revolution that will irrevocably change the human story. It arrives from the southeast, from the fertile crescent of the Near East, carried on the wind and in the minds of people. It is an idea, a set of technologies, the cultivations of wheat and barley, and the domestication of animals like sheep, goats, and cattle. It is agriculture. This was not a simple switch, where a tribe decided one Tuesday to give up hunting and start farming. For centuries, the two lifestyles coexisted, mingling at the frontiers. The spread of this new way of living is one of archaeology's great debates. Was it a wave of colonists, new peoples physically moving across the continent, displacing the old hunter gatherers? Or was it a more subtle diffusion of ideas, with local populations seeing the benefits of a settled life and adopting the practices for themselves? The truth, as it often is, seems to be a complex and messy combination of both. Genetic evidence suggests a significant migration, but it also shows the intermingling of the newcomers with the old Mesolithic peoples. One can imagine a cautious trade at the edge of a forest clearing, a hunter offering a fresh hide in exchange for a handful of strange, miraculous grain. This shift, however it happened, was a profound. For the first time, people could create a surplus of food. This meant they no longer had to move. They could build permanent homes, small villages of timber-framed houses daubed with wattle and clay. Life becomes anchored to a single place. A new kind of rhythm emerges, dictated not by the migration of the elk, but by the cycles of planting and harvest. Population begins to grow. With more mouths to feed, more land must be cleared. The great wildwood of Europe begins a slow retreat that will continue for thousands of years, as the farmer's axe and fire remake the continent field by field. This new, settled existence fosters new skills: pottery for storing grain, weaving for making cloth, and new social structures. For the first time, the concept of owning a piece of land begins to take root in the human mind. And then, as these societies become more stable and prosperous, something extraordinary begins to happen. They start to build. Not just huts and fences, but structures on a scale never before seen, monuments of earth and stone, so massive they would require the coordinated labor of entire communities, perhaps even multiple villages, working together for generations. This is the dawn of the megalithic age. All across the Atlantic fringe, from Spain and Portugal up through France and Britain and into Scandinavia, these silent stone giants begin to appear. They are dolmens, simple but powerful tombs made of massive stone slabs like houses for the dead. They are menhirs, single enigmatic standing stones pointing to the sky. And most famously, they are the great stone circles and passage tombs. To truly feel the mystery of this time, we need only to go to a place like the Boyne Valley in Ireland and stand before Newgrange. Built over 5,000 years ago, long before the pyramids of Egypt, it is a colossal mound of earth and stone, wider than a football field, held in place by a curb of 97 massive decorated boulders. It is a masterpiece of Neolithic engineering, but its true secret is hidden within. A long, narrow stone passage leads to a central chamber deep in the heart of the mound. For most of the year, it is a place of absolute, silent darkness. But for a few days around the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, something magical occurs. As the sun rises, a single precise beam of light penetrates a small opening above the entrance, the roof box, and travels the entire length of the 60-foot passage, slowly illuminating the central tomb. It is a breathtaking piece of astronomical alignment, a celestial clock built of stone, designed to capture the rebirth of the sun. What was this place for? Was it simply a tomb for a powerful chieftain or a revered priestess? Or was it a temple, a place of ritual where the whole community gathered to watch the turning of the great cosmic wheel? Was it a calendar, a way of marking the moment when the days would begin to lengthen again, promising the return of spring and life to the fields? The honest answer is that we don't know. The people who built it left behind no written language, no Rosetta Stone to decipher their intentions. All we have are these silent, magnificent structures. They are the first great architectural statements of European civilization, monuments that speak of a society with a deep understanding of the seasons and the stars, a complex social organization capable of mobilizing immense labor, and a powerful connection to their ancestors and their place in the cosmos. They are the true lost world of ancient Europe, a civilization not of gold, but of earth and stone, whose legacy stands silent witness to the very first chapter of our story. Those silent stone sentinels of the north, the great megaliths we left standing in the mists of prehistory, were a testament to a people looking inward, anchoring themselves to the soil and the cycles of the sun with immense earthbound gravity. But while they were heaving boulders into place, a different kind of society was awakening far to the south, on a sun-drenched island cradled by the brilliant blue of the Aegean Sea. This new civilization turned its face outward, not to the land but to the water. It was a world not of heavy gray stone, but of vibrant color, of light and air and motion, a world built on the rhythm of the waves. This was the civilization of Crete, Europe's first truly grand and complex society, which would later be named after a mythical king, Minos, whose name has become forever entangled with the legend of the labyrinth. We call them the Minoans, though we have no idea what they called themselves. Their story, for us, begins at the turn of the 20th century, with the determined spade of an English archaeologist named Arthur Evans. On a Cretan hillside, he uncovered the remains of a structure so vast and bewilderingly complex that he felt he had stumbled into the very myth he was chasing. This was the palace of Knossos. But the word palace feels inadequate, too stiff and formal for what he found. It was not a fortress, bristling with defensive walls like the castles of a later age. Instead, it was a sprawling organic city complex of over 1,000 interlocking rooms, built around a great central courtyard. It was a maze of corridors, grand staircases, storerooms, workshops, and shrines, all ingeniously designed with light wells and air shafts that made the whole structure seem to breathe. One can almost imagine the feeling of walking through it in its heyday, around 1700 BC, the cool breeze on your skin, the scent of olive oil and wine rising from hundreds of giant clay jars, some taller than a man, stored in the cavernous magazines, the murmur of voices echoing from workshops where artisans crafted exquisite pottery and delicate gold jewelry. And everywhere there was color. The Minoans painted their world with a joy and vivacity that is still breathtaking. The surviving frescoes, painstakingly pieced together from fallen fragments, show a people deeply in love with the natural world. We see dolphins and fish leaping through stylized blue waves, elegant partridges strutting amidst flowers, and monkeys climbing rocks. We see their people, too, slender, graceful figures with pinched waists and long, flowing black hair. We see elegant women with elaborate dresses and confident expressions, figures so strikingly modern that one was nicknamed La Parisienne by its discoverers. Their art is conspicuously, almost eerily, devoid of the themes that dominate so much of the ancient world. There are no great scenes of kings smiting their enemies, no grand battles or triumphant military parades. This, combined with the lack of fortifications, has led to the image of the Minoans as a uniquely peaceful people, a civilization that presided over a long era of tranquility known as the Pax Minoica, the Minoan peace. Their central obsession, if the art is any guide, was the bull. The bull is everywhere, on frescoes, on seals, on ornate drinking cups. And this culminates in their most famous and perplexing image, the bull leaping fresco. It shows a powerful bull in full charge. A youth with astonishing acrobatic skill grabs its horns, somersaults over its back, and is caught by a companion on the other side. What on earth was this? A death-defying sport? A sacred ritual? A rite of passage for the Minoan elite? It is a moment of pure, dynamic energy, frozen in time, and its exact meaning remains one of their deepest mysteries, a puzzle as intricate as the labyrinth itself. Alongside the bull, their religion seems to have centered on a powerful goddess, often depicted with snakes coiled around her arms, a mysterious symbol of the earth and regeneration. The double axe, or labris, was also a key religious symbol, found carved into the palace stones and as a votive offering. In fact, some scholars believe the very word labyrinth may simply mean the house of the double axe. The source of Gnosis' wealth and tranquility was the sea. The Minoans were the masters of the Bronze Age Aegean, a thalassocracy or sea power. Their sleek ships, powered by a single square sail and rows of oarsmen, plied the trade routes connecting Crete to mainland Greece, to Egypt, and to the Levant. They were the great merchants and mariners of their age, trading their fine pottery, their saffron, and their precious olive oil for the copper and tin they needed to make bronze, and for the gold and ivory that their artisans worked with such skill. Their power was projected not by legions, but by fleets, controlling the waves and the flow of commerce upon which the entire eastern Mediterranean depended. Yet for all their artistic openness, they remained deeply enigmatic. We have their writing, two distinct scripts found on clay tablets known as Linear A and Linear B. Linear B was famously deciphered in the 1950s, revealing an early form of Greek. But that script belongs to the very end of the Minoan story. The true classical Minoan script, Linear A, remains a complete mystery. We can pronounce the syllables, but the language they form is unknown, related to no other that we know of. The tablets seem to be mundane lists. So many jars of oil, so many sheep, so many textiles, the dry accounting of a complex bureaucracy. But the soul of the people, the language of their poems and prayers, is silent. And then this vibrant world ends. Around 1450 BC, the palaces across Crete are destroyed in a wave of fire and violence. For a long time, the sole culprit was thought to be one of the most violent natural disasters in recorded history, the eruption of the volcano on the nearby island of Thera, now known as Santorini. Sometime in the 17th or 16th century BC, Thera exploded with a force that makes Krakatoa look like a firecracker, blasting billions of tons of ash into the sky and triggering colossal tsunamis that would have scoured the northern coast of Crete. For many, this cataclysm was the clear historical basis for Plato's Atlantis story. Remember that? A mighty island civilization destroyed in a single day and night. The theory was perfect. But now the timeline seems off. The Minoans, it appears, survived the eruption, rebuilding in its aftermath, though they were surely weakened. The final blow came a century or two later. The evidence in the ruins, like the presence of new kinds of weapons and the decipherment of linear B, points not to a volcano, but to an invasion. A new, more militaristic power had been rising on the Greek mainland, a people we will come to know as the Mycenaeans. They were the ones who likely took advantage of a struggling Crete, seizing control of Knossos and its trade routes, adopting and adapting the culture they conquered. The end of this brilliant civilization was not a single clean cataclysm. It was a slow decline, a world mortally wounded by nature and finished off by the ambition of men. It did not sink beneath the waves, but was simply buried by the dust of time, leaving behind a beautiful ghost of a world that still whispers to us of bulls and goddesses, of palaces of light, and of a peace that could not last. The people who brought the final curtain down on the Minoan world, the ones who wrote in that early form of Greek known as Linear B, were of a very different character from the elegant, sea-trading Cretans they supplanted. They were a mainland people, forged in the rugged, mountainous landscape of the Peloponnese. They had learned much from the Minoans, their art, their writing, their administrative skills, but they filtered it all through a much sterner, more martial worldview. These were the Mycenaeans, the first Greeks of legend, and their world was not one of open-air palaces and bull-leaping dancers, but of mighty, fortified citadels, of warrior kings, and of the gathering clang of bronze on bronze. To understand them, one must travel to the citadel of Mycenae itself, the legendary home of King Agamemnon, who would lead the Greeks to Troy. Even in ruin, it is an intimidating sight. Perched atop a rocky hill commanding the plains of Argos, it is a predator's lair. Unlike the welcoming complexes of Crete, the first thing one encounters at Mycenae is a profound sense of defense. The walls are immense, built from colossal, roughly hewn limestone blocks, some weighing several tons. Later Greeks, marveling at these structures, could not believe they were the work of human hands, and said they must have been built by the mythical Cyclopes, hence the name Cyclopean masonry. The main entrance, the famous Lion Gate, is a masterpiece of imposing grandeur. Two great lionesses, their heads now lost to time, stand carved in relief above the lintel, powerful guardians of the stronghold within. To pass through that gate in its prime must have felt like entering the very heart of power. For centuries, this world was known only through the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, tales dismissed as brilliant fiction. That all changed in the 1870s with a wealthy and fantastically obsessive German amateur named Heinrich Schliemann. Armed with a single-minded conviction that Homer's stories were literal truth, he took his spade first to a mound in Turkey he believed was Troy, and then to Mycenae. His methods were often crude, more like a treasure hunter's than a modern archaeologist's. He blasted through layers of history with dynamite, but his discoveries were undeniably spectacular. Inside the citadel walls, he found a circle of deep shaft graves, the tombs of the city's founding royal dynasty. And from these graves, he pulled a treasure trove that stunned the world, intricate bronze daggers inlaid with scenes of lion hunts, delicate cups of gold, and most famously, a series of golden death masks, hammered to preserve the features of the kings they covered. One was so noble and well preserved that Schliemann, in a flourish of romantic certainty, declared to the king of Greece, I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. He was almost certainly wrong. The mask is centuries older than the supposed era of the Trojan War, but the name has stuck, a symbol of this lost civilization of gold. What these treasures and the citadel itself reveal is a society dominated by a warrior aristocracy. Mycenaean Greece was not a single, unified empire, but a collection of small, rival kingdoms centered on fortified palaces at places like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. At the heart of each palace was the Megaron, a great rectangular hall with a large circular hearth in the center, its roof supported by 4 columns. This was the throne room and audience chamber, a smoky, imposing space where the king, the Wanax, would hold court, feast his warriors, and dispense justice. The art they left behind reflects their values. They adopted Minoan styles, but their frescoes are stiffer, more formal. They paint processions of soldiers, scenes of hunting and chariot warfare. Their pottery is decorated with warriors in their fearsome boar's tusk helmets, a piece of armor described in vivid detail by Homer. Thanks to the decipherment of Linear B, we have a clearer picture of their world than we do of the Minoans. The thousands of clay tablets found, particularly at the Palace of Pylos, are not poems or histories, but the meticulous, almost obsessive records of a palace bureaucracy. They are inventories of everything, lists of chariot wheels needing repair, allocations of bronze to be made into swords and spearheads, records of perfume ingredients, and the names of textile workers, both male and female. It paints a picture of a highly controlled, top-down redistributive economy, where the palace collected all the produce of the surrounding land, the oil, the grain, the livestock, and doled it out to sustain its army and its artisans. It was a system geared for war, and it is for war that they are most remembered. The Trojan War, that grand, heroic 10-year siege, is their defining story. For millennia, it was simply a story. But Schliemann's excavations at the site of Hisarlik in Turkey uncovered the layered ruins of a city that was almost certainly the historical Troy. The archaeological layer, known as Troy Acetidizvitha, shows a city that was violently destroyed by fire around 1200 BC, precisely the time the Mycenaean civilization was at its height. It is highly unlikely that a fleet of 1,000 ships sailed to retrieve a single beautiful queen. But the Iliad is not a documentary. It is an epic poem, a story told and retold by bards for centuries before being written down. It is far more likely that it represents the cultural memory of a real historical conflict, or perhaps a series of conflicts. A great raiding expedition launched by the powerful Mycenaean kingdoms against a rich, rival city that controlled lucrative trade routes. The epic we have is the final, glorious, poetic version of that distant, brutal reality. Yet just like the Minoans before them, the Mycenaean world came to a sudden and violent end. Around the 1200 BC, all their great citadels were burned, their trade networks collapsed, and their complex society disintegrated. The cause of this collapse is one of the great, unsolved mysteries of archaeology. Was it internal conflict, with the rival kingdoms finally turning on each other in a devastating civil war? Was it prolonged drought and famine, leading to popular uprisings? Or was it an external foe? Egyptian records from this period speak of invasions by the mysterious Sea Peoples, coalition of seafaring raiders who were toppling empires all across the eastern Mediterranean. Perhaps the Mycenaeans were among their victims, their fortresses finally falling to this tide of chaos. Whatever the cause, the destruction was total. The palaces were abandoned, the art of writing was lost, and Greece plunged into a period of poverty and isolation that would last for centuries, a dark age, out of which the familiar world of classical Greece would eventually have to be reborn from scratch. When the great Mycenaean citadels fell, they did not fall into a void. They were part of a complex, glittering, interconnected world that stretched all across the eastern Mediterranean, and their collapse was just one domino in a much longer, more catastrophic chain of events. The fiery end of that warrior society was not a localized event, but a symptom of a much wider sickness, a systemic failure that brought an entire age of empires to its knees. What followed the heroic age of bronze was not a new and glorious chapter, but a profound and unsettling silence, a fog that descends upon the historical record for centuries. This was the late Bronze Age collapse, a time when the great civilizations of the Aegean and the Near East suddenly and violently unraveled, plunging the region into a long and poorly understood Dark Age. To grasp the scale of this catastrophe, we have to zoom out from Greece. Imagine a map of the world around 1250 BC. In Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the mighty Hittite Empire, a rival to the pharaohs of Egypt, ruled from their capital of Hattusa. Along the Syrian coast, wealthy port cities like Ugarit thrived on a bustling international trade, their scribes writing in a dozen languages on clay tablets. In Egypt, the new kingdom was still a formidable power, rich and ancient, and connecting them all was a web of trade routes, a circulatory system carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, gold from Nubia, and grain from the Nile Delta. It was a globalized world, in its own way, where the fates of kings in different lands were bound together by treaties, by royal marriages, and by the shared need for precious metals. Then, beginning around 1200 BC, this entire world came apart. Within the span of a single generation, almost every major city in the region was destroyed, many of them violently, never to be inhabited again. The Hittite Empire vanished so completely that for thousands of years it was considered a biblical fiction. The glittering city of Ugarit was burned to the ground. One of the last tablets found in a kiln, there is a desperate letter from its king, pleading for aid against an enemy fleet. The Mycenaean palaces, as we've seen, were all torched. Only Egypt, though severely weakened and knocked back on its heels, managed to survive the onslaught. It was as if a hurricane had swept through civilization itself, tearing down everything in its path. For a long time, the blame for this devastation was placed squarely on the shoulders of a mysterious group of invaders mentioned in Egyptian records, the Sea Peoples. On the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, Pharaoh Rameses III carved dramatic reliefs of his great battles against a confederation of strange enemies who came by land and sea around 1177 BC. The inscriptions describe them as a migrating horde, a people on the move with their families in ox carts who had laid their hands upon the lands as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting. The reliefs show a chaotic battle, with Egyptian ships grappling with the enemy fleet, whose warriors wear distinctive feathered headdresses or horned helmets. Egyptian texts name the tribes in this coalition: the Peliset, the Chaker, the Shekelesh, the Danaan, the Wayshesh. But who were they? This is one of history's most compelling whodunits. Their identities are still hotly debated. The Peliset are almost universally identified with the Philistines, who would later settle on the coast of Canaan. Others have been speculatively linked to Sicily, Sardinia, and even the Danaan Greeks from Homer's epics. The most common theory is that they were a collection of displaced peoples from across the Aegean and Anatolia, perhaps even including Mycenaean Greeks, whose own society had already collapsed, now turned pirate and refugee, searching for a new home. They were not a unified army, but a symptom of the chaos, a wave of desperate people pushed from their homelands. But even a massive wave of migrants doesn't fully explain why everything fell apart. Modern scholars now see the collapse not as a single event, but as a perfect storm, a catastrophic failure of a complex system brought on by multiple interlocking crises. The Sea Peoples were the final blow, not the sole cause. There is mounting evidence from pollen analysis and river sediments that the entire region was gripped by a prolonged and severe drought at this time. This would have led to widespread crop failures and famine year after year. A starving populace is a desperate populace, prone to internal revolts against the palace elites who controlled the food stores. Remember those meticulous linear B tablets? They describe a rigid top-down system. Such systems are efficient in good times, but incredibly brittle. When the crops failed and the ships stopped arriving with metal, the whole house of cards came crashing down. The intricate trade network that supplied the tin and copper needed for bronze weapons and tools was severed. Without bronze, the armies of the great kings, with their expensive and resource-heavy chariots, were rendered obsolete. The whole system seized up, and the people it could no longer feed or protect simply abandoned the cities or rose up and burned them down. In Greece, the aftermath was stark. The population is estimated to have dropped by as much as 75%. The complex world of the Wanax and his scribes vanished completely. The art of writing was forgotten for over 400 years. The vibrant frescoes and fine goldwork disappeared, replaced by simple pottery decorated with stark geometric patterns. Grand tombs gave way to simple pit graves. It was a world that had become smaller, poorer, and more isolated. People abandoned the ruined citadel sites and lived in small, scattered villages, scratching out a subsistence living. It was, in every sense, a dark age. But this darkness was also a crucible. The collapse, for all its destruction, wiped the slate clean. It shattered the rigid, hierarchical palace cultures of the Bronze Age, creating a power vacuum. And into this vacuum, new ideas and new social structures could slowly begin to grow. During this period, a new metal, iron, which was more readily available than the components of bronze, began to be worked. In the quiet of a village smithy, a blacksmith hammering a new kind of tool or weapon was a sign of a new beginning. The great kings were gone, but in these small, independent communities, a new kind of political life was stirring, one that was not centered on a single, all-powerful ruler, but on the community itself. The seeds of the classical Greek polis, the city-state, were being sown in the dark, fertile soil of this collapsed world. The age of grand palaces and godlike kings was over, but the age of the citizen was, slowly and quietly, about to begin. For nearly 400 years, The Greek world had been a landscape of quiet, isolated villages, a land of shadows where the ghosts of the great Mycenaean kings lingered in oral tales of a lost golden age. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the darkness begins to recede. The population, having fallen so catastrophically, begins to grow again. Small villages expand, merging into larger settlements. The lonely footpaths that connected them see more traffic, as traders once again begin to move goods, and more importantly, ideas from one small valley to the next. Sometime around 800 BC, the light comes back on. This new era, a period of dynamic and often turbulent rebirth, is what we call the Archaic Age. One of the first and clearest signs of this reawakening was the return of the written word, but it was not the cumbersome linear B script of the palace bureaucrats that returned. Instead, the Greeks, through their renewed contact with the seafaring merchants of the Levant, adopted and ingeniously adapted the alphabet of the Phoenicians. They took the Phoenician system, which consisted only of consonants, and added a revolutionary innovation: vowels. This created the first true alphabet, a flexible and relatively simple system of writing that was far easier to learn than the complex scripts of the old empires. For the first time, literacy was not the exclusive domain of a specialized scribal class. It was a tool that could belong to any citizen, a technology that would prove fundamental to the new kind of society that was emerging. Another sign of a new, shared consciousness appeared in 776 BC, the traditional date for the founding of the Olympic Games, a festival where men from all across the Greek-speaking world would gather to compete, a reminder of their common language, gods, and culture. Out of this ferment, a new and revolutionary form of social and political organization began to crystallize: the polis, or city-state. The polis was more than just a city. It was a fiercely independent, self-governing community composed of a central town, Aste, and its surrounding countryside, Cora. Typically, the town was built around a defensible high point, the Acropolis, which served as a religious center and a final place of refuge. Below it was the Agra, an open space that was both a marketplace and the heart of public life, where citizens could gather to trade, to talk, and to argue. The revolutionary core of the polis was this new idea of the citizen, politis. You were not merely a subject of a distant king living in a fortified palace. You were an active, recognized member of a community with both rights and responsibilities. Why did this unique political form arise here? The rugged geography of Greece, a land of small plains divided by steep mountain ranges, certainly played a role, creating natural, defensible pockets for independent communities to develop. But a more profound shift was happening in the nature of warfare. The age of the chariot-riding aristocrat was over. The key to the battlefield was now the hoplite, a heavily armed foot soldier. Each hoplite was a citizen soldier, typically a farmer of moderate means, who could afford his own equipment. A large round shield, the hoplon, a long spear, a sword, and bronze armor. They fought shoulder to shoulder in a tight, disciplined formation called a phalanx. The phalanx was a human tank, a wall of shields and spears that was nearly unbreakable from the front. Its strength lay not in the heroic duels of individuals, but in the collective discipline of the group, in each man holding his position to protect the man beside him. This hoplite revolution had profound political consequences. These men, the farmers and craftsmen who made up the bulk of the army and whose courage decided the fate of the state, began to demand a political voice. If they were expected to fight and die for the polis, they deserved a say in how it was run. This new political energy, combined with a growing population and a shortage of good farmland, unleashed a remarkable wave of colonization. Over a period of 2 centuries, hundreds of Greek city-states sent out expeditions to found new communities all around the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts. A mother city, the metropolis, would choose a founder and send out a group of colonists to establish a new, independent polis and a poikia, or a home away from home. Greek cities sprouted from the shores of Spain and France to the coasts of Libya and the Crimea. Great cities like Syracuse in Sicily, Naples in Italy, and Byzantium on the Bosphorus all began as Greek colonies. This process not only relieved population pressure, but also created a vast network of trade and spread Greek language, culture, and the polis model across a huge area, creating what we call the Hellenic world. Amidst the hundreds of city-states that emerged, 2 began to develop in starkly different ways, their unique characters destined to shape the future of Greece. In the fertile region of Attica, Athens turned its face to the sea. It became a vibrant hub of trade and pottery production, open to new ideas from abroad. Its early government was dominated by an aristocracy, but growing economic inequality and social tension led to a series of reforms by wise leaders like Solon, who canceled debts, forbade debt slavery, and created a framework of laws that gave more power to common citizens, laying the first deep foundations of democracy. Far to the south, in the isolated valley of Laconia, Sparta turned its back on the world. The Spartans were not traders or colonists, they were conquerors. They had subjugated their neighbors, the Messenians, and turned them into a vast population of state-owned serfs called helots. The constant, terrifying threat of a helot uprising forced the Spartans to make a radical choice. They would transform their entire society into a permanent military camp. Every male Spartan citizen was a soldier from birth to death. Boys were taken from their mothers at age 7 to be raised in brutal public barracks, the agoge, a system designed to strip them of all individuality and forge them into perfectly disciplined soldiers. Sparta was a society of extreme conservatism, discipline, and military might, ruled by 2 kings and a council of elders, a state that sacrificed everything, art, comfort, freedom, for the sake of its own security. Athens and Sparta were like oil and water, 2 irreconcilable visions of what a Greek polis could be, and their rivalry would one day set their world on fire. As Athens and Sparta continued to evolve along their separate, divergent paths, one toward the open sea of commerce and democracy, the other into the disciplined austerity of a landlocked military state, they remained largely consumed by their own affairs and their petty rivalries with neighboring city-states. They were 2 of hundreds of fractious, independent Greek communities, proud of their own identities and often suspicious of one another. But far to the east, a shadow was stretching across the world, a power so vast that it would soon force these quarrelsome Greeks to make a choice they had never truly faced before: unite or be conquered. This was the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the first true global superpower. Under enlightened kings like Cyrus the Great and his successor Darius, the Persians had forged an empire of unprecedented scale and sophistication. It stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the shores of Egypt and Libya in the west. It was a multi-ethnic, multilingual empire ruled by a single, absolute monarch, the King of Kings, from magnificent capitals like Susa and Persepolis. Compared to this organized behemoth, the Greek world was a chaotic scattering of tiny, insignificant states. But the empire's expansion had brought it to the shores of the Aegean, where it had swallowed up the Greek city-states of Ionia on the coast of modern-day Turkey. And these Ionian Greeks, with their stubborn love of independence, were not happy subjects. In 499 BC, they rose in revolt against Persian rule. In a fateful and perhaps thoughtless act of solidarity, Athens sent 20 ships to aid their Ionian cousins. An allied force marched inland and burned the Persian regional capital of Sardis to the ground. From the Persian perspective, this was an act of terrorism, an intolerable insult from a minor upstart city they had barely even heard of. When King Darius was told the news, he is said to have had a servant repeat to him 3 times every day at dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians," so his vengeance would be methodical and absolute. After crushing the Ionian revolt, Darius turned his attention west. In 490 BC, a Persian fleet carrying a large invasion force sailed across the Aegean. Their mission was to punish Athens and install a pro-Persian tyrant. They landed on a wide, crescent-shaped beach, a place called Marathon, about 26 miles from Athens. The Athenian army, composed of about 10,000 hoplites, raced to meet them, blocking the road to the city. For several days, the two armies faced each other in a tense standoff. The Persians, confident in their superior numbers and their cavalry, waited. The Athenians, knowing they were outnumbered and outmatched, waited for promised help from Sparta that was delayed by a religious festival. Finally, the Athenian general Miltiades, fearing the Persians would reboard their ships and sail directly for the city, made a daring choice. He decided to attack. He deliberately weakened the center of his phalanx and reinforced the wings. Then, he ordered his men to charge, running the last stretch across the plain to minimize their exposure to the hail of Persian arrows. The Persian center, as expected, pushed back the weak Athenian line, but the strengthened Athenian wings crushed the Persian flanks and then turned inward, enveloping the best of the Persian infantry in a classic pincer movement. The result was a stunning, shocking slaughter. The Persians broke and fled in panic back to their ships. By the end of the day, over 6,000 Persians lay dead on the beach. The Athenians had lost only 192 men. A runner, perhaps the famous Pheidippides of legend, was dispatched to carry the news of the incredible victory to the anxious city, a run that would be immortalized in the modern marathon race. Athens had saved itself, and in doing so, had proven that the mighty Persian war machine was not invincible. For 10 years, Greece breathed a fragile sigh of relief. But in Athens, one man, a brilliant and cunning politician named Themistocles, knew that the Persians were not done. Darius died, but his son, Xerxes, inherited his father's ambition for revenge on a far grander scale. Themistocles argued passionately in the Athenian assembly that the next invasion would be far larger and would come by both land and sea. He convinced his fellow citizens to use the profits from a massive new silver strike, not for a public handout, as was proposed, but to build a fleet of 200 advanced warships, the sleek, bronze-rammed vessels called triremes. It was a decision that would change the course of history. In 480 BC, Xerxes' invasion began. It was an operation of terrifying scale. Ancient historians speak of millions of men, a number modern scholars have reduced to a still staggering force of perhaps 200,000 soldiers and over 1,000 ships. To ease the army's passage, Xerxes' engineers dug a canal across a peninsula and lashed together a bridge of boats across the Hellespont Strait. It was a display of power meant to awe the world into submission. Many Greek states did submit, but a small coalition of about 30 cities, led by Sparta on land and Athens at sea, resolved to resist. Their first stand was at a narrow mountain pass in the north called Thermopylae. Here, a tiny Greek force, led by the Spartan king Leonidas and his 300 elite warriors, held the pass for 3 days against the full might of the Persian army. It was a suicidal delaying action designed to buy time for the Greek fleet and the defense of the south. They were eventually betrayed and surrounded, but they fought to the last man, creating an immortal legend of courage in the face of impossible odds. With the pass taken, the Persians poured into central Greece and burned and evacuated Athens to the ground. The Greek cause seemed lost. The Allied fleet was cornered in the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the mainland. It was here that Themistocles' foresight paid its dividend. He lured the massive, unwieldy Persian fleet into the tight confines of the straits. In the ensuing chaos, the smaller, more agile Greek triremes, powered by citizen oarsmen fighting for their homes, ran circles around the Persian galleys, ramming and sinking them with brutal efficiency. From a golden throne set up on a hillside, Xerxes watched in horror as his invincible navy was annihilated. Discouraged, Xerxes returned to Persia, leaving his general Mardonius to finish the job. The next spring, in 479 BC, the final act was played out on the plains of Plataea. Here, the largest Greek hoplite army ever assembled, with the disciplined Spartan phalanx at its heart, faced the remaining Persian infantry. In a long and brutal battle, the Greeks were once again victorious, crushing the Persian army and killing its commander. On the very same day, the remnants of the Persian fleet were destroyed by Greek ships at the Battle of Mycale on the Ionian coast. The great invasion was over. Against all odds, the tiny, divided world of the Greeks had preserved its freedom, setting the stage for an unprecedented explosion of confidence and culture that would radiate from the city that had sacrificed the most, Athens. In the smoking ruins of their twice-sacked city, the Athenians returned not with despair, but with a giddy, almost boundless sense of self-belief. They had stood at the heart of the resistance. Their fleet had been the instrument of the decisive victory at Salamis, and they had seen their homes and temples burned for the sake of Greek freedom. Out of this sacrifice came an electrifying confidence. They felt that history had chosen them for a special destiny. This conviction, combined with the power they now wielded, would ignite a cultural firestorm, a period of roughly 50 years of such breathtaking achievement in art, politics, and philosophy that it is still regarded as a touchstone for Western civilization. This was the golden age of Athens. The immediate aftermath of the war saw the Greek world divided. Many states, particularly those on the islands and the Ionian coast, still feared the return of the Persians. Sparta, ever insular and wary of foreign entanglements, was reluctant to commit to a long-term defense of the Aegean. And so, Athens, with its unrivaled new navy, stepped into the power vacuum. In 478 BC, they founded the Delian League, a voluntary alliance of city-states dedicated to liberating the remaining Greek cities from Persian rule and protecting against future attacks. Each member state swore an oath and contributed either ships or, more commonly, a sum of money, a tribute to a common treasury on the sacred island of Delos. At first, the League was a stunning success, driving the Persians from the Aegean. But over time, its nature began to change. Athens was clearly the dominant partner, the hegemon, and its grip began to tighten. States that tried to leave the alliance, arguing that the Persian threat was over, were brutally suppressed, their walls torn down, and their navies confiscated. The League was slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, being transformed from a defensive alliance into an Athenian empire. The final symbolic step came in 454 BC, when the League's treasury was moved from Delos to Athens itself, ostensibly for safekeeping. The tribute money of the allies now flowed directly into the Athenian coffers. The dominant political figure of this era, the man whose name is synonymous with the Golden Age, was Pericles. An aristocrat by birth, but a radical democrat by conviction, Pericles was a brilliant orator and a masterful strategist who led Athens for over 30 years. He believed passionately in the Athenian democratic system, which had by now reached its most complete form. All major decisions were made by the assembly, the ecclesia, where any male citizen could speak and vote. To ensure that even the poorest citizens could afford to leave their work to participate in their government, Pericles introduced state pay for serving on juries and in other public offices. It was a system built on the radical belief that ordinary people were capable of governing themselves. But there was a deep and troubling contradiction at the heart of Pericles' Athens. At home, it was a vibrant democracy, celebrating the freedom and equality of its citizens. Abroad, it was an increasingly oppressive imperial power, ruling over subjects who were given no voice and whose tribute was extracted by force. Pericles made no apologies for this. He argued that the security and prosperity of Athens depended on its empire, and he put the empire's wealth to stunning use. With the Persian threat gone, he convinced the Athenian assembly to use the vast reserves of the Delian League's treasury to fund a building program of unparalleled ambition aimed at rebuilding the temples on the Acropolis that the Persians had desecrated. It was to be a monument to the glory of Athens and its patron goddess, Athena. The result was one of the most beautiful and influential collections of buildings ever created. The centerpiece was the Parthenon, designed by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, with its sculptural program overseen by the master artist Phidias. The Parthenon was the physical embodiment of Athenian confidence. It is a temple of Doric columns that appears at first glance to be a model of straight-lined perfection, but it is a building of subtle, living curves. The columns bulge slightly in the middle, the stylobate, the floor, rises gently toward the center, and the columns all lean almost imperceptibly inward. These optical refinements give the massive stone structure a sense of energy and grace, a feeling of being alive. Inside stood Phidias's masterpiece, a 40-foot tall statue of Athena Parthenos, crafted from gold and ivory. The entire building was a celebration of the victory of the rational, civilized Greeks over the chaotic forces of barbarism, a message reinforced in the intricate sculptures of its pediments and friezes. This explosion in art and architecture was matched by an equal flourishing of the intellect. Athens in the age of Pericles was a magnet for the greatest minds in the Greek world. In its agora, one could find Socrates, a famously odd-looking stonemason who would wander about, engaging citizens from all walks of life in conversations that relentlessly questioned their most cherished beliefs about justice, virtue, and piety. He wrote nothing down, but his method of inquiry, this constant probing dialogue, would become the foundation of Western philosophy. This was also the age when theater became a powerful art form. At great public festivals, the entire city would gather to watch the plays of the three great tragedians. Aeschylus, who had fought at Marathon, wrote of grand mythic struggles. Sophocles, in plays like Oedipus Rex and Antigone, explored the tragic conflicts between human will and divine fate. And Euripides, the most modern of the three, delved into the dark corners of human psychology. These plays were not mere entertainment. They were a civic institution, a way for the democracy to reflect on its deepest values and anxieties. And beside the tragedians was the brilliant comic playwright Aristophanes, whose wild, satirical, and often obscene comedies poked fun at the leading politicians and thinkers of the day, a testament to the remarkable freedom of speech that existed in the city. The first great works of history were also being written, as Herodotus composed his grand inquiry into the Persian Wars, and a younger man, Thucydides, began to ponder the looming conflict that he could see was inevitable, a conflict between Athens and Sparta, born of the very power and arrogance that made the Golden Age possible. The Golden Age of Athens, for all its splendor, cast a long and ominous shadow. The gleaming marble of the Parthenon was paid for with the tribute of an empire, and every ship in Athens's powerful fleet was a reminder to the rest of the Greek world of its subservience. The city's dynamic energy, its democratic swagger, and its relentless expansion began to look less like leadership and more like a threat. And nowhere was this threat felt more keenly than in Sparta. The historian Thucydides, an Athenian general who lived through the conflict that was to come, wrote that its truest cause was the growth of Athenian power and the fear this instilled in the Lacedaemonians. It was a classic geopolitical trap, a rising, disruptive power challenging the established conservative one. The clash that followed was not just a war between two cities. It was a devastating, generation-long civil war that would tear the entire Hellenic world apart, a conflict known as the Peloponnesian War. It began in 431 BC, a collision between two fundamentally different ways of life and warfare, a struggle often described as one between an elephant and a whale. Sparta, the elephant, possessed the most formidable land army in Greece, a phalanx of professional soldiers who had never lost a major battle. Their strategy was simple and direct. Invade Attica, the countryside surrounding Athens, burn the olive groves and vineyards, and challenge the Athenians to a decisive hoplite battle, which the Spartans were certain they would win. Athens, the whale, had its unmatched navy, the wealth of its empire, and its impregnable fortifications. The strategy of Pericles was equally clear: refuse to fight the Spartans on land. He ordered the entire rural population of Attica to abandon their farms and withdraw behind the security of the long walls, the massive defensive corridors that connected Athens to its vital port of Piraeus. From this island-like fortress, the Athenian navy would keep the city supplied with grain from overseas and launch raids on Spartan territory. Pericles knew Athens could not win a land war, but he gambled that Sparta could not win a long war of attrition. The first years of the war unfolded exactly as planned. The Spartans marched in, the Athenians withdrew, and the two sides glared at each other across the city walls. But in the second year of the war, a horrific and unforeseen disaster struck Athens. The city, now dangerously overcrowded with refugees from the countryside, became a breeding ground for disease. A terrible plague swept through the population, a virulent sickness of unknown origin that caused fever, vomiting, and extreme agony. Thucydides, who caught it and survived, left a terrifyingly clinical account of its symptoms. The plague killed perhaps a third of the population, including many of the rowers who powered the fleet. Crucially, among its victims was Pericles himself. His death left Athens without its most steady and authoritative leader, opening the door for a new generation of more aggressive and often reckless politicians, known as demagogues. The war dragged on, a grim and brutal affair that slowly eroded the norms and decencies of Greek society. It became a conflict of atrocities and reprisals, of allies switching sides, of civil strife within cities between pro-Athenian democratic factions and pro-Spartan oligarchic ones. An uneasy truce, the Peace of Nicias, brought a temporary halt to the fighting, but the underlying tensions remained, and the war soon resumed with even greater ferocity. The Athenians, in a chilling display of imperial arrogance, descended upon the neutral island of Melos, demanding it join their empire. When the Melians refused, citing their right to remain independent, the Athenians conquered the island, executed all the adult men, and sold the women and children into slavery. The war's great turning point came not in Greece, but far to the west, in Sicily. In 415 BC, driven by a thirst for glory and vast new resources, the Athenian assembly voted to launch a massive naval expedition to conquer the powerful and wealthy city of Syracuse. It was an incredibly ambitious, almost hubristic undertaking. The expedition was placed under the command of a brilliant, handsome, and dangerously charismatic young nobleman named Alcibiades. But shortly after the fleet set sail, Alcibiades's political enemies in Athens accused him of sacrilege, and he, fearing for his life, defected to Sparta, where he proceeded to give them expert advice on how to defeat his own city. The Sicilian expedition, deprived of its most dynamic leader and bogged down in a difficult siege, turned into a monumental catastrophe. The Syracusans, with Spartan help, trapped the Athenian fleet in their harbor and destroyed it. The Athenian army, attempting to retreat overland, was harassed, captured, and annihilated. Tens of thousands of Athens's best soldiers and sailors were killed or condemned to a slow death in the stone quarries of Syracuse. It was a self-inflicted wound of staggering proportions, a disaster from which Athens would never truly recover. The end was now only a matter of time. The Athenian empire began to crumble as subject states, sensing weakness, rose in revolt. Even more humiliating, the Spartans, in a stunning act of geopolitical irony, secured funding to build their own fleet from their old enemy Persia, who saw a perfect opportunity to sow chaos among the Greeks. Under the command of a cunning and capable general named Lysander, the new Spartan navy finally cornered and destroyed the last Athenian fleet at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BC. The naval lifeline was cut. Starving and completely defeated, Athens surrendered the following year. The terms of the peace were harsh. The Athenian Empire was dissolved. The city's democracy was replaced by a brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. And in a moment of ultimate humiliation, the proud long walls, the symbol of Athenian power and security, were torn down to the triumphant music of Spartan flutes. Sparta had won, but the victory was hollow. The war had lasted for 27 years, leaving a legacy of ruin and bitterness. The real loser was not Athens, but the Greek polis itself. A century of confidence had curdled into cynicism, and the entire Greek world was left exhausted, impoverished, and hopelessly divided, an easy prize for a new, ambitious power that was quietly watching and learning from the north. While the Greek city-states were ascending to their brilliant and tragic crescendo, a different and altogether more mysterious civilization was flourishing on the rolling, vine-covered hills of the Italian peninsula. For centuries, while Athens was experimenting with democracy and Sparta was honing its phalanx, this other people built magnificent cities, sailed the seas as expert traders, and developed a rich, vibrant culture all their own. They are a people who speak to us most clearly from their tombs, a civilization that was eventually swallowed so completely by its successor that it has remained a profound and captivating enigma. These were the Etruscans, the great lost civilization of pre-Roman Italy. Their heartland was the region of Etruria, the land we now know as Tuscany, an area rich in fertile soil and crucially metal ores. From about the 8th century BC, they rose to prominence, organizing themselves not into a single kingdom, but into a loose confederation of 12 powerful and wealthy city-states. But who were they? Where did they come from? This question was a mystery even in antiquity. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, claimed they were migrants from Lydia in Anatolia, modern Turkey, a people who had fled a terrible famine to find a new home in the West. Another ancient writer, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, insisted that they were indigenous, an ancient Italian people who had always been there. The debate rages on to this day. Modern genetic studies have offered tantalizing clues, suggesting some link to the Near East, but the picture is complex. Their language only deepens the mystery. It is not part of the Indo-European family of languages, like Latin or Greek, and stands as a strange linguistic island in ancient Europe. While we can read their alphabet, which they adapted from the Greeks, we only partially understand the language itself, as most of our examples come from thousands of short, repetitive funerary inscriptions telling us little more than names and lineages. What we know of their world comes not from grand histories or epic poems, but from the incredible cities of the dead they left behind. At sites like Cerveteri and Tarquinia, the Etruscans created vast necropolises, laid out like real cities with streets and town squares. The tombs themselves were not just simple graves, but subterranean houses for the afterlife, carved from the soft volcanic rock. Inside, they were decorated to look just like the homes of the living, with carved stone beds, chairs, tools, and household objects, all meant to provide comfort for the soul in its eternal journey. And on the walls of these tombs, particularly at Tarquinia, the Etruscans painted their world for us in breathtakingly vibrant frescoes. And what a world it was! While Greek art from the same period was often focused on mythology, heroic stillness, and ideal forms, Etruscan art is full of movement, energy, and a palpable joy for life. We see scenes of lavish banquets, where men and women recline together on couches, a detail that shocked the more patriarchal Greeks and suggests a relatively high and public status for Etruscan women. We see dancers moving to the music of the lyre and the double flute, fishermen casting their nets, and athletes competing in games. The art is not of gods and heroes, but of a wealthy aristocracy enjoying the good things in life and hoping to continue that enjoyment in the next. It is a warm, spontaneous, and deeply human world that they reveal. They were a deeply religious people, but their view of the cosmos seems to have been tinged with a sense of fatalism. They believed human destiny was controlled by the gods, and that the future could be discerned, but not changed, by those with the proper training. They were masters of the art of divination. Priests, known as haruspices, would interpret the will of the gods by examining the entrails of sacrificed animals, particularly the liver, which they saw as a microcosm of the heavens. They also practiced augury, reading divine signs in the flight of birds and in flashes of lightning. This complex and disciplined religious science, which the Romans called the Disciplina Etrusca, was highly respected and would later be adopted wholesale by their Italian neighbors. For several centuries, the Etruscans were a major Mediterranean power. Their merchants traded far and wide, and their influence spread across much of Italy. And for a long time, the most important city on the southern edge of their sphere of influence was a small settlement on the banks of the Tiber River, Rome. The traditional story of early Rome holds that its last three kings were Etruscans from the Tarquin dynasty. Whether this is literally true or not, the Etruscan cultural impact on early Rome was immense. They gave the Romans their alphabet, the architectural arch, the gladiatorial games, which likely began as funerary rituals, the purple-bordered toga worn by magistrates, and many of their most important religious rites. In many ways, Etruria was Rome's teacher, but the Etruscan civilization began to wane. Their loose confederation of cities often failed to unite against common enemies. From the north, Celtic tribes swept down into Italy, weakening the Etruscan hold on the Po Valley. From the south, the Greek colonies, particularly Syracuse, challenged and eventually broke Etruscan sea power. But their greatest threat came from their former pupil. The Roman Republic, having thrown off its last king, began a slow, methodical, and relentless expansion. One by one, over the course of more than a century, the great Etruscan cities fell to the Roman legions. The Romans absorbed their territory, their people, and their culture until the Etruscan language fell silent and their distinct identity faded into a memory. All that remained were their cemeteries, quiet and beautiful cities of the dead, sleeping under the Tuscan sun, a silent testament to the vibrant and enigmatic people who laid the cultural foundations for the civilization that would one day conquer the world. The long, drawn-out suicide of the Peloponnesian War had left the Greek world in a state of profound exhaustion. The glorious confidence of the 5th century had evaporated, replaced by a weary cynicism. Sparta's victory had been short-lived. Their heavy-handed rule proved deeply unpopular and was soon challenged and broken by the rising power of the city-state of Thebes. What followed was a dismal and seemingly endless cycle of petty, debilitating warfare, with alliances shifting like sand as Athens, Sparta, and Thebes constantly vied for dominance. The genius of the polis, its fierce independence, had become its fatal flaw. The city-states had bled each other white, leaving the entire Hellenic world fractured, demoralized, and vulnerable. And all the while, on the mountainous northern frontier, a formidable new power was watching, learning, and quietly gathering its strength. This was the kingdom of Macedon. To the sophisticated city dwellers of Athens and Corinth, Macedon was a backward, semi-barbaric place. It was a rural kingdom of farmers and horsemen, ruled by a hard-drinking, polygamous monarchy, not a community of citizens. They spoke a rough dialect of Greek that grated on southern ears, and their political life was a turbulent affair of assassinations and dynastic squabbles. For centuries, Macedon had been a minor player on the geopolitical stage, but in 359 BC, a man came to the throne who would transform this provincial backwater into the most powerful military force the world had yet seen. His name was Philip II. Philip was a man of immense cunning, patience, and boundless ambition. In his youth, he had spent 3 years as a political hostage in the city of Thebes at the height of its power. This was no prison, but a political education. He studied the advanced military tactics of the Theban general Epaminondas, who had been the first to smash the myth of Spartan invincibility. When Philip returned to Macedon and seized the throne, he brought this knowledge with him and began a radical overhaul of his kingdom. He started with the army. He took the traditional Greek phalanx and perfected it. He armed his infantrymen, the pagetairoi or foot companions, with a terrifying new weapon, the sarissa, an enormous pike, some 18 feet in length. Held in staggered rows, the sarissas of the first 5 ranks of the Macedonian phalanx presented an almost impenetrable hedge of spear points. To this unstoppable infantry formation, he added the finest cavalry in Greece, the elite companion cavalry, composed of Macedonian nobles who fought alongside their king. He also developed sophisticated siege engines, allowing him to take cities that had once been considered impregnable. He turned the Macedonian army from a local militia into a disciplined, professional fighting force, loyal to him personally. With this new army, and with the wealth from the gold mines he controlled, Philip began to extend his influence southward into the Greek heartland. He was a master of diplomacy and deception, preferring to use bribery and political maneuvering to achieve his aims, but always with the threat of his army as the final argument. In Athens, the great orator Demosthenes delivered a series of fiery speeches, the Philippics, desperately warning his fellow citizens of the growing threat from the north, but the Greeks could not overcome their chronic disunity to form a lasting opposition. Finally, in 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, the matter was settled. A combined army from Athens and Thebes, the last great hope of an independent Greece, met Philip's veteran force. The battle was a masterpiece of tactics. Philip commanded one wing, while on the other, He gave command of his elite companion cavalry to his 18-year-old son, Alexander. At a crucial moment, Alexander led a decisive charge that shattered the Greek lines. The victory was total. The age of the free and independent Greek city-state, which had burned so brightly for centuries, was effectively over. Philip did not treat the defeated Greeks as a conquered people. Instead, he gathered them together at Corinth and formed a new alliance, the League of Corinth, with himself as its hegemon or leader. He then announced the grand purpose of this new, unified Greece, a great pan-Hellenic war of revenge against the Persian Empire, to finally punish it for the invasions of Xerxes a century and a half earlier. It was a brilliant political move, giving the fractious Greeks a common enemy and a noble cause to rally behind. But just as the vast invasion force was being prepared, in 336 BC, Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards during his daughter's wedding celebration. The exact motives remain a murky historical mystery. Was it a simple act of personal revenge, or were more powerful figures involved? Philip's estranged wife, the formidable Olympias, and even Alexander himself have been suspected of having a hand in the plot. The throne passed to his son, now Alexander III, a young man of just 20. His father's rivals and the ever-hopeful Greeks saw an opportunity in the seemingly inexperienced new king. They were catastrophically mistaken. Alexander moved with lightning speed, crushing rebellions in the north. When the proud city of Thebes rose in revolt, Alexander marched south and made a terrifying example of it. He sold its population into slavery and razed the city to the ground, leaving only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar standing. The message to the rest of Greece was brutally clear. The new king was in charge. With his base secure, Alexander returned to his father's grand project. In 334 BC, at the head of a magnificent, battle-hardened army of Macedonians and Greeks, he crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. He was 22 years old, and he was about to unleash upon the Persian Empire and the world a military campaign of such speed, daring, and success that it would become the stuff of legend. The age of Philip was over. The age of Alexander the Great had just begun. The campaign that the young Alexander unleashed upon Asia was less a war and more of a whirlwind, a political and military hurricane that tore across a continent for 11 relentless years. In a breathtaking series of battles at the Granicus River, at Issus, and finally at Gaugamela, he systematically dismantled the Persian Empire, the superpower that had loomed over the Greek world for 2 centuries. The Persian king, or Darius III, was defeated, hunted, and eventually killed by his own followers. Alexander marched into the legendary cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the last of which he controversially burned, perhaps as a grand, symbolic act of revenge for the burning of Athens. He was welcomed as a liberator in Egypt, where he was declared a pharaoh and founded the first and greatest of his many new cities, Alexandria, on the coast of the Mediterranean. But he did not stop. Driven by an insatiable curiosity and a burning desire, a pothos to reach the ends of the world, he pushed his army ever eastward, over the mountains of the Hindu Kush into modern-day Afghanistan and Central Asia, and then south across the Indus River into India. He was a brilliant, charismatic, and often ruthless leader, fighting in the front ranks with his men, sharing their hardships and earning their fanatical devotion. But in India, at the banks of the Hyphasis River, his magnificent, war-weary army finally had enough. They had been campaigning for 8 years and had marched thousands of miles from home. They refused to go any further. A furious Alexander was forced to turn back. He led his men on a grueling and deadly march back to the heart of his new empire, arriving in Babylon in 323 BC. Here, while planning new campaigns into Arabia and the West, he suddenly fell ill with a fever, and within days he was dead. He was not yet 33 years old. He had conquered the known world, but he had left no plan for how it should be governed, and more importantly, no clear heir. He had a half-brother who was mentally unfit to rule and a wife who was pregnant with his son, but there was no adult successor. On his deathbed, when his generals asked him to whom he left his kingdom, he is said to have whispered, "Toi kratistoi," to the strongest. Whether he actually said these words or not, they perfectly describe what happened next. His empire, the largest the world had ever seen, became the ultimate prize in a brutal 50-year free-for-all fought among his most powerful and ambitious generals, the Diadochi, or successors. These men, commanders like the cunning Ptolemy, the steady Seleucus, and the fierce Antigonus the One-Eyed, were not interested in carving up the empire peacefully. At first, each of them dreamed of winning the whole prize, of becoming the next Alexander. What ensued was the Wars of the Successors, a long and dizzyingly complex series of conflicts, shifting alliances, betrayals, and assassinations. The dream of a unified empire died with men like Antigonus on the battlefield. The vast territory Alexander had conquered was too large, too diverse to be held together by a single ruler. The political earthquake of his death shattered his legacy into 3 major pieces, which would eventually crystallize into 3 great kingdoms, ruled by the dynasties of his generals. In Egypt, the shrewd and cautious Ptolemy took control. He famously hijacked Alexander's funeral procession, bringing the great conqueror's body to be entombed in Alexandria, a move that gave his own rule immense legitimacy. He and his descendants would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years as the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek pharaohs that would end with the famous Cleopatra. They ran Egypt as a highly efficient, centralized state, with a Greek Macedonian elite governing the native Egyptian population from their magnificent new capital of Alexandria, which quickly became the largest, wealthiest, and most intellectually vibrant city in the world. The largest portion of the empire, the vast swathe of territory stretching from Anatolia through Mesopotamia and Persia to the frontiers of India, fell to Seleucus. His Seleucid empire was a sprawling, multi-ethnic behemoth, incredibly wealthy but almost impossible to govern effectively. For its entire history, it would be plagued by internal revolts and external threats, a constant struggle to maintain control over its diverse peoples. And back in the Macedonian homeland, after a long and chaotic struggle, the dynasty of Antigonus Gonatas, the grandson of Alexander's general, would secure the throne. The Antigonid kingdom of Macedon was the smallest of the 3, but it held the Macedonian heartland and maintained a difficult, often resented dominance over the old city-states of Greece. This new world, the world forged in the chaotic aftermath of Alexander's death, is known as the Hellenistic Age. The term refers to the Hellenizing or spreading of Greek culture which Alexander's conquests had initiated. Greek became the common language of government, trade, and learning across the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. New Greek-style cities were founded everywhere, becoming islands of Hellenic culture in a sea of ancient traditions. This fusion created a new, cosmopolitan civilization, one that was different in spirit from the classical world of the polis. The focus shifted from the small, insular city-state to the large, multi-ethnic kingdom. Art became more emotional, dramatic, and realistic, capturing the struggles of individuals rather than the serene ideals of the community. New philosophies like Stoicism and Epicureanism emerged, teaching people how to find personal peace and ethical guidance in a vast and often unpredictable world. And the intellectual center of gravity shifted from Athens to Ptolemaic Alexandria, where the great library and museum became a magnet for scholars, scientists, and poets, a place where Greek knowledge was preserved, cataloged, and expanded upon for centuries. Alexander's dream of a unified political empire had failed, but his legacy was perhaps even greater. The creation of a new, interconnected Hellenistic world that would in time become the stage for the next great conquering power rising in the West. While the great generals of Alexander were carving up his conquests in a sprawling, bloody contest for imperial power, and while the Hellenistic world was buzzing with new philosophies and scientific discoveries in glittering capitals like Alexandria, a very different story was quietly unfolding in the West. On the Italian peninsula, a single city-state, nourished by the waters of the Tiber River, was slowly gathering its strength, fueled not by a world-conquering legacy, but by a powerful and gritty origin myth. To understand the Romans, we must first understand the story they told about themselves, a tale that begins not with historical fact, but in the dying embers of the Trojan War. Their story starts with the hero Aeneas, a Trojan prince who, as the city of Troy burned, escaped the carnage carrying his elderly father on his shoulders and leading his young son by the hand. Commanded by the gods, Aeneas and a band of Trojan refugees journeyed for years across the Mediterranean, seeking a new home. After many trials, they finally landed in Italy, in the kingdom of Latium. Here, Aeneas married a local princess, and his descendants ruled for generations, a line of kings in a new city called Alba Longa, establishing the Trojan bloodline in the heart of Italy. Centuries passed. In Alba Longa, a good king, Numitor, was overthrown by his cruel and ambitious brother, Amulius. To eliminate any future rivals, Amulius had Numitor's sons murdered and forced his daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, sworn to a lifetime of celibacy. But the gods had other plans. The war god, Mars, descended and lay with Rhea Silvia in her temple. From this divine union, she gave birth to twin boys of extraordinary size and beauty. Their names were Romulus and Remus. King Amulius, enraged and terrified, ordered the infants to be thrown into the Tiber. But the servant charged with the grim task took pity on them. Instead of drowning them, he placed them in a basket and set them afloat on the river, which was then swollen with rain. The current, guided by divine will, did not sweep them away, but gently deposited the basket on the riverbank at the foot of a hill that would one day be called the Palatine. Here a miracle occurred. A she-wolf, having lost her own cubs, heard the babies' cries. She came down to them and with astonishing gentleness began to lick them clean and offer them her teats to suckle. The divine children were nursed by the wild beast until they were discovered by a humble shepherd named Faustulus, who took them home to his wife and raised them as his own sons. The boys grew into strong, brave, and natural leaders among the other shepherds, famous for their courage in fighting off wild animals and bandits. It was during a dispute with the herdsmen of the deposed King Numitor that Remus was captured and brought before his grandfather, though neither knew the other's identity. When Romulus gathered a force to rescue his brother, Faustulus finally revealed to him the secret of his birth. At the same time, Numitor, struck by Remus's noble bearing, had pieced together the story. The family was reunited, and the two heroic brothers led an uprising, killed the usurper Amelius, and restored their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa. But the twins were filled with a desire to found their own city near the place where they had been so miraculously saved. This is where their story turns to tragedy. They quarreled over which of the 7 hills to build upon, Romulus favoring the Palatine, Remus the Aventine. To settle the matter, they agreed to an augury, a sacred ritual of watching for omens from the flight of birds. Remus was the first to see a sign, 6 of vultures. But shortly after, Romulus saw a flight of 12. Each claimed victory, Remus for seeing the birds first, Romulus for seeing the greater number. The dispute festered as Romulus began to dig a trench and build a low wall for his new city on the Palatine. Remus, in a fit of mockery, jumped over it, taunting his brother for the weakness of his fortifications. In a flash of rage, Romulus struck his brother down, killing him. Standing over his brother's body, he uttered the grim-founding words of his city, "So perish all who ever cross my walls." Thus, on April the 21st, 753 BC, the traditional date of its founding, the city of Rome was born, baptized in a brother's blood. This is the legend. It's a brutal, powerful story about divine origins, savage beginnings, and a grim, unyielding sense of purpose. It is the story that every Roman child grew up hearing. The archaeological reality, of course, is less dramatic. The area of Rome had been settled for centuries before 753 BC, and the city likely formed through the slow and gradual merging of several small Latin and Sabine villages on the hilltops. The date is a symbolic one, created later to give Rome a definitive starting point. The city that Romulus founded was a monarchy. Roman tradition tells of a line of 7 kings, beginning with Romulus himself, who is credited with creating the city's first legions and its first senate. His successors were a mix of Latins, Sabines, and, as we've seen, Etruscans. They are credited with building the city's first great temples, its first bridge over the Tiber, and its first massive sewer, the Cloaca Maxima. This was the Roman kingdom, a period shrouded in legend, where Rome was a small but tough city-state, absorbing the culture of its more advanced Etruscan neighbors to the north. The final king in this traditional line was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. He ruled as a tyrant, seizing power by force and despising the Senate and the Roman people. His reign would be brought to a dramatic and violent end by an event so shocking that it would cause the Romans to reject the very idea of kings forever, and in its place create something new, a republic. The reign of Rome's last king, Tarquin the Proud, was a study in arrogance and cruelty. He had seized the throne through murder and ruled through fear, treating the Senate with contempt and the people as his personal property. The Romans, a people who even then possessed a deep-seated sense of honor and justice, endured his tyranny with gritted teeth, waiting for a spark to ignite their resentment. That spark came not from a political conspiracy, but from a deeply personal tragedy, a story of virtue violated that would become the foundational legend of their new government. The story, as the Roman historian Livy tells it, begins at a military camp where the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, and a group of other young noblemen were drinking. They began a drunken debate about which of their wives was the most virtuous. To settle the matter, they rode back to Rome to surprise the women. They found the wives of the other nobles feasting and partying, but when they went to the house of a nobleman named Collatinus, they found his wife, Lucretia, sitting late at night, virtuously spinning wool with her maids. Her quiet dignity inflamed a lustful obsession in Sextus Tarquinius. A few nights later, he returned to her house alone. He was welcomed as a guest, but after the household was asleep, he went to Lucretia's chamber with a drawn sword. He professed his love, then threatened her, but Lucretia, unafraid of death, refused him. It was only when he made a final, diabolical threat that he would not only kill her, but would also kill a male slave and place the naked bodies together, claiming to have caught them in an act of adultery, that she finally submitted. The threat of this ultimate posthumous dishonor was more than she could bear. The next day, a grief-stricken Lucretia summoned her father and her husband. She told them what had been done to her, refusing all comfort by saying, "What is safe for a woman when her honor has been lost?" She made them swear an oath of vengeance against Sextus Tarquinius. Then, declaring that no unchaste woman should live by her example, she drew a dagger she had hidden in her robes and plunged it into her heart, dying in their arms. Among the men present was a nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus, a relative of the king who had for years feigned being a simpleton. The name Brutus means dullard, to avoid the king's murderous jealousy. But in this moment of horror, he dropped his disguise. Pulling the bloody dagger from Lucretia's body, he held it aloft and swore by her blood to drive the Tarquins from Rome and to ensure that no man would ever again be king in the city. He led the others in carrying Lucretia's body to the Roman Forum. There, he displayed her wound and told the story of the rape to the assembled crowds. The people, inflamed with righteous fury, rose up in revolution. The gates of the city were closed, the Tarquins were driven into exile, and the monarchy was abolished forever. The year was 509 BC. Having rid themselves of one tyrant, the Romans were now obsessed with preventing the rise of another. The very word for king, rex, became the most hated and feared word in their political vocabulary. In place of the monarchy, they created a new form of government, something they called the res publica, literally, the public thing, or the people's affair. The core principle was the division of power. Supreme authority, once held by the king for life, would now be invested in two men, called consuls, who were elected for a term of only 1 year. Each consul had the power to veto or forbid the actions of the other, ensuring a constant check on power. The most powerful and enduring institution was the Senate, an advisory council of 300 elders composed of the heads of the most powerful families and former magistrates who served for life. While they couldn't pass laws directly, their advice, the Senatus Consultum, carried immense weight, and they controlled the state's finances and foreign policy. But this new republic was far from a democracy. Roman society was rigidly divided into two classes, or orders. There were the patricians, a small handful of wealthy aristocratic families who claimed descent from the original senators appointed by Romulus. They dominated the Senate and monopolized all political and religious offices. And then there was everyone else, the plebeians. This group included everyone from poor farmers and laborers to wealthy merchants and artisans who lacked a patrician pedigree. The first 2 centuries of the Republic were defined by the struggle of this plebeian majority to win political equality from the patrician elite, a conflict known as the struggle of the orders. The plebeians' ultimate weapon was remarkably not violence, but a form of collective bargaining, the secession. When their grievances became unbearable, the entire plebeian population would march out of the city en masse, set up camp on a nearby hill, and refuse to work or serve in the army until their demands were met. The patricians, left without an army to defend the city or workers to tend the fields, were forced to negotiate. Through a series of these secessions, the plebeians slowly and painstakingly won their rights. They gained their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs, who were declared sacrosanct and had the power to veto any act of the Senate or a magistrate. They forced the codification of the law in the 12 tables so that justice was no longer a secret known only to patrician priests. Eventually, they won the right to marry patricians and, crucially, the right to be elected to the consulship and all other offices of the state. By around 287 BC, this long internal struggle was largely over. The plebeians had achieved political equality. The process had forged a new, more stable Roman state, one built on a shared set of laws and a sense of common purpose. This remarkable internal resilience, this ability to compromise and adapt without destroying itself, was one of Rome's greatest strengths. Now, with its internal house in order, this tough, disciplined, and newly unified republic was ready to turn its gaze outward, beyond its own hills, and begin the long, bloody, and relentless conquest of Italy. Having forged a unified and resilient state through 2 centuries of internal struggle, the Roman Republic now controlled the entire Italian peninsula. But as this young, land-based power began to look beyond its own shores, its gaze fell upon the island of Sicily, a rich and strategic prize. And in doing so, it came face to face with the other great power of the Western Mediterranean. This was Carthage, the mighty maritime empire that had dominated the seas for centuries. Located on the coast of modern-day Tunisia, Carthage was an ancient Phoenician colony that had grown into the hub of a vast commercial network, its powerful navy protecting trade routes that stretched from the shores of the Levant to the Atlantic coast of Africa. The clash between these 2 rising powers was perhaps inevitable. The series of 3 epic conflicts that followed, known as the Punic Wars, would be the ancient world's equivalent of a world war, a titanic struggle that would last for over a century and would ultimately determine the destiny of the Mediterranean. The First Punic War, which began in 264 BC, was a contest for Sicily. It immediately presented Rome with a seemingly insurmountable problem. Carthage was a sea power. Rome was a land power with virtually no navy. In a typically Roman display of brute force ingenuity and sheer determination, they set about solving this problem. After capturing a wrecked Carthaginian warship, a five-banked vessel called a quinquerem, they reverse engineered it, using the wreck as a blueprint to build an entire fleet from scratch. To compensate for their inexperience as sailors, they invented a secret weapon, the corvus, or crow. This was a long, heavy boarding bridge with a sharp spike on its underside. When an enemy ship drew near, the Romans would drop the corvus, its spike biting into the enemy's deck, locking the two ships together. The sea battle was instantly transformed into a land battle, and Roman legionaries would swarm across the bridge, where their superiority in close quarters combat was decisive. With this innovation, Rome won the First War, forcing Carthage to give up Sicily and pay a massive indemnity. Carthage's humiliation bred a deep desire for revenge, a desire that was embodied in one of the most brilliant military minds in all of history, Hannibal Barca. As a young boy, Hannibal's father, a Carthaginian general, had made him swear a sacred oath upon an altar to be a lifelong enemy of Rome. When Hannibal came to command the Carthaginian forces in Spain, he began to meticulously plan a second war, one so audacious in its conception that it still beggars belief. In 218 BC, he set out from Spain with a large professional army, including several dozen war elephants, on one of the most legendary marches in history. He led his forces across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and then, in a feat of supreme endurance, he crossed the snow-covered Alps in winter to descend into Italy from the north, completely bypassing Rome's sea power and its southern defenses. For the next 15 years, Hannibal rampaged through Italy, a seemingly invincible force. He inflicted a series of devastating defeats on the Romans, each a masterpiece of tactical genius. At the Trebia River and at Lake Trasimene, he used cunning ambushes to destroy entire consular armies. His crowning achievement came in 216 BC at the Battle of Cannae. Facing a Roman army almost double the size of his own, Hannibal deliberately allowed his center to fall back, luring the massive Roman force forward into a trap. His elite cavalry then swept around the Roman flanks, enveloping and annihilating them. It was a perfect battle of annihilation, a tactical masterstroke that is still studied in military academies today. Any other state in the ancient world would have surrendered, but Rome's greatest strength was its unbreakable resilience. Even in their darkest hour, with Hannibal at their gates, the Romans refused to negotiate. They adopted a strategy of attrition known as the Fabian strategy, avoiding direct battle with Hannibal while slowly rebuilding their strength. And they produced a general of their own who was Hannibal's equal, a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio realized that Hannibal could not be defeated in Italy, so he took the war to Carthaginian territories, first conquering their holdings in Spain, and then, in a daring move, he invaded North Africa itself, threatening the city of Carthage directly. The plan worked. Hannibal was finally recalled from Italy to defend his homeland. The final showdown came in 202 BC on the plains of Zama. There, Scipio, having studied Hannibal's tactics, was able to counter them, finally defeating the great Carthaginian general and ending the second and greatest of the Punic Wars. Half a century passed. Carthage was now a shadow of its former self, a second-rate power posing no real threat. But in Rome, a generation had grown up with the terrifying stories of Hannibal, and a deep, paranoid fear of a Carthaginian resurgence lingered. One senator, Cato the Elder, became the voice of this fear, ending every speech he gave, regardless of the topic, with the grim refrain, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BC, Rome, on a flimsy pretext, declared a third and final war. It was not a war of equals, but a brutal act of annihilation. After a heroic 3-year siege, the city of Carthage was taken. What followed was a week of systematic destruction. The city was burned to the ground, its buildings leveled, and its people were either massacred or sold into slavery. The Punic Wars were over. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. But this victory, won at such a tremendous cost, had transformed the Republic into a vast, wealthy, slave-owning empire, creating a host of new social and political tensions that would soon threaten to tear it apart from within. While Rome was engaged in its life and death struggle with Carthage, locking horns with Hannibal in Italy, and asserting its dominance over the Mediterranean sea lanes, the vast majority of the European continent to its north was dominated by a very different people. From the misty, rain-swept islands of Britain and Ireland to the deep forests of Gaul and the plains of the Danube, this was the age of the Celts. They were not a unified empire like Rome, but a dazzling and diverse tapestry of tribes who, for the better part of a millennium, were the masters of Iron Age Europe. To speak of the Celts is to speak of a shared culture, not a single nation. They were a people bound together by a family of related languages, by similar religious beliefs, and by a breathtakingly beautiful and distinctive style of art. At their peak, their territory stretched from Spain to Turkey, a vast heartland of fierce warriors, master metalworkers, and enigmatic priests. Because they left behind no written literature of their own, our view of them is hazy, seen through two very different windows. The spade of the archaeologist, which unearths their hill forts and the spectacular treasures buried in their graves, and the pen of their enemies, the Greeks and Romans, who wrote about them with a mixture of fear, fascination, and condescending prejudice. Celtic society was tribal and fiercely aristocratic, organized around a warrior elite who prized personal bravery and prowess in battle above all else. A chieftain or king would surround himself with a war band of loyal followers, rewarding them with feasts, praise from the bards, and a share of the spoils of war. Their settlements ranged from small farming homesteads to massive fortified settlements called oppida, which served as tribal, political, and commercial centers. They were renowned throughout the ancient world as formidable warriors. The Romans, in particular, never forgot the trauma of 390 BC, when a Gallic warband had swept down into Italy, defeated a Roman army, and sacked the city of Rome itself, a humiliation that was burned into the Roman psyche. The Celtic charge was a terrifying thing to behold. A wild, screaming rush of warriors, their hair often stiffened with lime to look like manes, fighting with long swords, and in some cases, fighting naked to show their contempt for death. Yet their culture was far from being just one of savage warfare. It was also one of profound spiritual depth and artistic genius. The intellectual and spiritual life of the Celts was guided by a powerful and mysterious class of individuals known as the Druids. The Druids were far more than just priests. They were the tribe's lawkeepers, its judges, its healers, its philosophers, and the living repositories of its sacred oral traditions. Training to become a Druid could take up to 20 years, during which an apprentice had to memorize a vast body of knowledge, including genealogies, laws, and thousands of verses of poetry and religious lore. They held immense political power, able to arbitrate disputes between tribes and then even halt battles in their tracks. They taught the doctrine of reincarnation, believing the soul was immortal and passed from one body to another after death. They held their ceremonies in sacred, untouched groves of oak trees, and Roman writers, most notably Julius Caesar, wrote with a horrified fascination of their alleged practice of human sacrifice, though how widespread this actually was remains a subject of intense debate. The other great legacy of the Celts is their art. The style, known as Latin, is unlike anything else in the ancient world. Where Greek and Roman art prized symmetry and realistic depiction of the human form, Celtic art was abstract, swirling, and alive with energy. It is a style of elegant, looping curves, of spirals and trumpet shapes, and of fantastical hidden faces and animals that morph and dissolve into pure pattern. This art found its highest expression in their metalwork. Celtic artisans were unsurpassed masters of working with bronze, iron, and gold. From their workshops came magnificent objects like the intricately decorated Battersea shield, dredged from the River Thames, or the great Gundastroup cauldron, a silver vessel covered in scenes of gods and mythic beasts. Noblemen and women would wear heavy ornate neck rings called torques as a sign of their status. Exquisitely crafted objects of twisted gold or bronze. This was not the art of the city, but the art of the forest and the spirit world, a visual language of profound beauty and complexity. For centuries, this vibrant tribal world thread across Europe, but the Celts' greatest strength, their fierce independence, was also their greatest weakness. The hundreds of tribes were often at war with one another, making it impossible for them to form a unified, lasting front against external threats. And by the 2nd century BC, they were being squeezed from two directions. From the north and east, Germanic tribes were beginning to migrate southward, putting pressure on their borders. And from the south, the methodical, relentless, and highly organized military machine of the Roman Republic was beginning to push northward, out of Italy and into the Celtic lands of Gaul. The vibrant, chaotic, and disunited world of the Celtic tribes was about to collide with the singular ambition of one of Rome's greatest and most ruthless generals. The disunity that ran through the Celtic world, that fierce, tribal independence that was both its greatest strength and its most profound weakness, would prove to be its fatal undoing when it came up against a Roman governor with a singular combination of military genius, political cunning, and a bottomless well of personal ambition. By the middle of the 1st century BC, the Roman Republic was in a state of terminal crisis. The immense wealth gained from its conquests had poisoned the political system, creating a vast gulf between the super-rich and the dispossessed poor. The old rules of the Republic were breaking down, and politics had become a dangerous game played by powerful individuals who commanded the personal loyalty of their armies. In this volatile climate, one man, Gaius Julius Caesar, saw military command on the frontier of Gaul not just as a duty, but as an opportunity to forge the wealth, the glory, and the loyal army he needed to claim the ultimate prize, supreme power, in Rome. In 58 BC, Caesar took up his post as governor of a slice of Roman-controlled territory on the Gallic frontier. His official mandate was to defend the province, not to conquer new lands. But a man like Caesar does not wait for opportunities. He creates them. His pretext came when the Helvetii, a large Celtic tribe from modern-day Switzerland, began a mass migration westward. Claiming this movement threatened Roman security, Caesar mobilized his legions and brutally crushed them. With this act, he lit a fire that would consume Gaul for the next 8 years. His campaign, which he would later document in his own brilliantly written and self-serving account, the Commentaries on the Gallic War, was a masterclass in Roman imperialism. Caesar's primary strategy was one of divide et impera, divide and conquer. He expertly exploited the ancient rivalries between the Gallic tribes, presenting himself as a champion to one tribe in order to make war upon another. Year after year, he pushed his legions deeper into Gaul, shattering the resistance of one tribal confederation after another. He was a brilliant and relentlessly aggressive commander, moving his legions at astonishing speed and demanding absolute discipline. He fought the fierce Belgae in the north, who he claimed were the bravest of all the Gauls. He built a fleet to defeat the seafaring Veneti on the Atlantic coast. And in 2 acts of supreme political theater designed to awe his audience back in Rome, he did what no Roman commander had done before. He built a timber bridge across the mighty Rhine River in just 10 days to campaign briefly in Germania, and he launched 2 separate invasions of the mysterious fog-bound island of Britain. For years, no Gallic leader could forge a united front against him. But as Roman brutality and oppression grew, so too did Gallic resentment. In 52 BC, the simmering anger finally exploded into a massive coordinated uprising led by a charismatic young chieftain of the Arverni tribe named Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix was a clever and formidable opponent. He understood that he could not defeat Caesar's legions in a pitched battle. Instead, he united a large number of tribes and adopted a new, devastating strategy, a scorched earth policy. He had his own people burn their own towns, villages, and granaries to deny food and supplies to the invading Roman army. The campaign became a desperate chase across Gaul, culminating in one of the most extraordinary sieges in military history. Vercingetorix and his main army of some 80,000 warriors took refuge in the heavily fortified hilltop town, or oppidum, of Alesia. Caesar, arriving with his legions, immediately began to encircle the settlement, constructing an 11-mile-long line of siege works, walls, ditches, and watchtowers to trap the Gallic army. But soon, news came that a massive Gallic relief army, numbering perhaps 250,000 men, was marching to break the siege. Caesar's army was now itself about to be besieged, caught between the warriors in the fortress and the huge army approaching from without. In a display of audacious military engineering, Caesar ordered his men to build a second, even longer line of fortifications, this one facing outward, creating a 13-mile ring to defend against the relief force. The Romans were now trapped in their own siege lines, a donut of defense between two enormous enemy armies. The final battle was a desperate, multi-day affair, with the Romans fighting frantically in both directions. In the end, the legendary discipline of the Roman legionaries, combined with Caesar's tactical genius at the height of the crisis, won the day. The Gallic relief army was beaten back and dispersed. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix, his people starving and his hope of rescue gone, made the decision to surrender to save his men. In a final dramatic act, he is said to have donned his finest armor, ridden his horse out of the gates alone, and circled Caesar's command post before dismounting and casting his weapons at Caesar's feet in silent submission. The great revolt was broken. The war was over. Gaul, a land that had been home to hundreds of independent tribes for centuries, was now a Roman province. The human cost was staggering. Ancient sources claim 1 million Gauls were killed and another million sold into slavery. Caesar, for his part, had achieved everything he had set out to do. He was now fabulously wealthy, the celebrated conqueror of a vast new territory, and most importantly, the commander of a veteran, fanatically loyal army. Back in Rome, his rivals in the Senate, particularly his former ally Pompey, now watched his rise with undisguised terror. The stage was set for the final, bloody act of the Roman Republic's collapse, a civil war that would pit its two greatest generals against each other. With the conquest of Gaul complete, Julius Caesar stood at the head of a battle-hardened, fanatically loyal army, his name a legend, and his coffers overflowing with the spoils of war. He was the most powerful man in the Roman world, and his very success now posed a mortal threat to the Republic itself. Back in Rome, the Senate, now led by his former ally and great rival Pompey, watched his rise with a mixture of envy and terror. They saw in Caesar the specter of a new king, a man whose personal power and popularity eclipsed the authority of the state. They issued an ultimatum. Caesar must give up his command, disband his legions, and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar knew it was a trap. Without the legal immunity of his command, his political enemies would immediately put him on trial for a host of trumped-up charges, and his career would be over. The final fatal standoff of the collapsing republic had arrived. In January of 49 BC, Caesar led a single legion to the banks of the Rubicon, a small river that marked the legal boundary between his province and the Italian heartland. To cross it with an army was an act of treason, a declaration of civil war. He is said to have hesitated on the bank, weighing the momentous decision. Then, with the famous words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. He ordered his men to advance. Caesar's move was so swift and unexpected that it caused a panic in Rome. Pompey and the majority of the Senate, their own legions unready and scattered across the provinces, made the fateful decision to abandon Italy. They fled east across the Adriatic to Greece, where they planned to raise a massive army to crush the rebellious general. Caesar, meanwhile, marched down the Italian peninsula, not as a brutal conqueror, but as a man of the people, offering clemency to those who submitted. In just 60 days, he was the master of Italy without a single major battle. The decisive confrontation came the following year, in 48 BC, on the plains of Pharsalus in northern Greece. Pompey had assembled a force that outnumbered Caesar's veteran legions by more than 2-1. But Caesar's troops were the finest fighting force in the world, and Caesar himself was the superior general. In a brilliant and hard-fought battle, Caesar's smaller army completely shattered Pompey's forces. Pompey the Great, the conqueror of the East, fled the battlefield, his cause in ruins. He sought refuge in Egypt, hoping for support from the young pharaoh, Ptolemy III. But the pharaoh's court advisors, seeing which way the wind was blowing, decided to curry favor with the victor. And as Pompey stepped ashore, he was stabbed to death and beheaded. When Caesar arrived in pursuit a few days later, he was presented with his rival's head. Far from being pleased, Caesar was reportedly disgusted by the treacherous murder of a great Roman. He was soon drawn into a civil war of his own in Egypt, between the young pharaoh and his fiercely intelligent and ambitious older sister, Cleopatra. Caesar famously sided with Cleopatra. After a brief but intense war fought in the streets of Alexandria, he defeated her brother's forces and established her as the sole ruler of Egypt. She would also become his lover and would later bear him a son, Caesarion. For the next few years, Caesar conducted a series of lightning campaigns, mopping up the last pockets of senatorial resistance in North Africa and Spain. After one such rapid victory in Asia Minor, he sent back to the Senate the most concise and arrogant military report in history. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. He returned to Rome in 45 BC, the undisputed master of the Roman world. The civil wars were over, and he was showered with honors. He was eventually named Dictator Perpetuo, or Dictator for life. He was a magnanimous victor, pardoning many of his former enemies, and he began a wide-ranging program of reforms. He relieved debt, resettled his veterans in colonies across the empire, launched massive new building projects, and famously reformed the chaotic Roman calendar, creating the Julian calendar that, with minor adjustments, is still in use today. But for all his genius, he fundamentally misjudged the psyche of the Roman aristocracy. His open accumulation of supreme, king-like power was a mortal offense to a class that had defined itself for nearly 500 years by its hatred of kings. A conspiracy began to form, led by a group of senators who called themselves the Liberators. The ringleaders were Gaius Cassius Longinus, a bitter personal enemy of Caesar's, and Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar had pardoned and promoted, and who was a direct descendant of the Brutus who had driven out the last king. They convinced themselves that they were not murderers, but tyrannicides, patriots acting to restore the freedom of the Republic. On the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, they put their plan into action. As Caesar entered a meeting of the Senate being held at a theater built by his great rival, Pompey, the conspirators surrounded him. One pulled on his toga, the signal to attack. They drew daggers hidden in their robes and fell upon him. He was stabbed 23 times, collapsing and dying at the foot of Pompey's statue. The Liberators, their hands covered in Caesar's blood, ran into the streets, proclaiming that the tyrant was dead and the Republic was saved. They could not have been more wrong. By killing Caesar, they had not saved the Republic. They had only guaranteed its final, agonizing death, plunging the Roman world into one last, even more terrible, round of civil war. The daggers of the Liberators had killed Caesar the man, but in doing so, they had unleashed Caesar the idea, a legacy of power that would haunt the Roman world and spark one final, catastrophic civil war. The conspirators, Brutus and Cassius had naively believed that by simply removing the tyrant, the Republic would magically spring back to life. They had no plan for what to do next, and in the power vacuum that followed the assassination, two figures immediately moved to claim Caesar's mantle. The first was Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal co-consul and most trusted general, a charismatic, hard-living soldier with immense popularity among the people and the legions. The second was a complete surprise, a sickly, studious, and utterly unknown teenager named Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew, who upon reading Caesar's will, discovered that he had been adopted as the dictator's son and named his primary heir. Antony, at first, dismissed the boy, but the young heir, now calling himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, moved with a cunning and ruthless precision that belied his 18 years. He used his new name and vast inheritance to raise an army from Caesar's veterans, who flocked to the banner of their great commander's son. For a time, Antony and Octavian clashed, but they soon realized they had a common enemy in the liberators, who had fled east to raise their own armies. In 43 BC, the two rivals, along with a lesser general named Lepidus, put aside their differences and formed the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the informal alliance of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this was an official, legally constituted three-man dictatorship with the power to rule the state. Their first act was a brutal one, a wave of proscriptions, or state-sanctioned murders, to eliminate their political enemies in Italy and seize their wealth. Hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy Romans were executed, their heads displayed in the Forum. Among the victims was the great orator Cicero, whose brilliant speeches against Antony earned him a place at the top of the death list. With their power in Rome secured, the triumvirate moved east. At the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia in 42 BC, their combined legions met and crushed the armies of Brutus and Cassius. With their cause lost, both of the lead conspirators took their own lives, following a Roman tradition of choosing suicide over the dishonor of capture. Caesar was avenged. With the liberators gone, the uneasy alliance between the two most powerful men in the world, Antony and Octavian, began to fray. They divided the Roman world between them. Antony, the senior partner, took the glamorous and wealthy East, while Octavian was left with the difficult and chaotic West. Antony established his base in Alexandria, where he rekindled Caesar's famous affair with the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. He saw in Egypt a source of immense wealth and a power base from which he could dominate the Roman world. Octavian, meanwhile, remained in Rome, where he masterfully played the part of the traditional Roman, working tirelessly to consolidate his power and win the loyalty of the Senate and people. From Rome, Octavian waged a brilliant propaganda war against his rival. He portrayed Antony as a man who had abandoned his Roman heritage, a decadent Eastern potentate who had been bewitched by a foreign queen. He spread rumors that Antony planned to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Alexandria and to rule as a Hellenistic king with Cleopatra at his side. The campaign was a stunning success, painting the coming conflict not as another squalid civil war, but as a patriotic defense of Roman values against a foreign threat. The final confrontation came in 31 BC. At the naval battle of Actium, off the coast of Greece, the fleet of Octavian, commanded by his lifelong friend and brilliant general Marcus Agrippa, met the combined fleets of Antony and Cleopatra. The battle was a decisive victory for Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra managed to break through the line and escape back to Egypt, but their army and the bulk of their navy surrendered. The following year, Octavian invaded Egypt. As his legions closed in on Alexandria, Antony, given a false report that Cleopatra was already dead, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, after a final, failed attempt to negotiate with the cold and calculating Octavian, famously took her own life, supposedly by the bite of an asp, rather than be paraded through the streets of Rome in his victory triumph. At the age of 32, Octavian stood alone, the undisputed master of the entire Roman world. A century of brutal civil war, which had begun with the Gracchi brothers and ended with the suicides in Alexandria, was finally over. But Octavian had learned the fatal lesson of his great uncle Caesar. He knew that the Romans would never accept an overt king or dictator. And so, in an act of supreme political genius, he created a new system of government by pretending to restore the old one. In 27 BC, in a carefully staged piece of political theater, he went before the Senate and announced that he was relinquishing all his emergency powers and returning the Republic to the authority of the Senate and the people of Rome. The grateful and relieved senators, in turn, begged him to retain command and bestowed upon him a new, semi-divine title, Augustus, the revered or illustrious one. This was the Augustan settlement. Augustus carefully maintained all the old forms of the Republic. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, and the assemblies still gathered. But he held the real power. He was the commander of all the important legions. He had the legal powers of a tribune, and he called himself the princeps, or first citizen. He created the illusion that he was merely the first among equals, guiding the restored republic. In reality, he had created a disguised monarchy, a system we call the Principate. After 100 years of bloodshed, he had brought peace, stability, and an order. This new era, the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, marked the end of the Roman Republic and the true beginning of the Roman Empire. The peace that Augustus established, the Pax Romana, was more than just the end of civil war. It was the foundation for a new way of life that would define the Western world for 2 centuries. For the first time in history, a single, stable government ruled a vast territory stretching from the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-scorched deserts of Syria, from the Rhine River in Germany to the cataracts of the Nile in Egypt. Tens of millions of people, speaking hundreds of different languages and worshiping thousands of different gods, were now united under the rule of one emperor, one system of law, and one formidable army. Our story now moves from the great wars and political revolutions to the lives of the ordinary people who inhabited this immense and diverse empire at the height of its power. The heart of Roman civilization was the city. Across the empire, from London to Leptis Magna, Roman cities were built on a remarkably consistent model, acting as miniature versions of Rome itself. They were centers of government, commerce, and culture, connected by the famous network of straight, paved Roman roads that made travel and communication easier and faster than ever before. A typical city would have a central public square, the Forum, which was the hub of civic and commercial life. Here, you would find the Basilica, a large hall that served as a law court and business exchange, alongside temples dedicated to the Roman gods and to the emperor himself. Life was made comfortable by incredible feats of engineering, great aqueducts that brought fresh water from distant hills, public latrines, and underground sewer systems. Daily life for a Roman depended entirely on who you were. For the wealthy elite, a day might begin with a light breakfast before the morning salutatio, a ritual where his less powerful clients would visit his grand house or domus to pay their respects and receive legal or financial assistance in exchange for their political support. The domus itself was a private oasis centered around an open-air courtyard called an atrium, and often featuring a beautiful walled garden, a peristyle surrounded by rooms decorated with colorful frescoes and intricate floor mosaics. After a morning of business in the forum, the afternoon was for leisure. The focal point of Roman social life was the public baths. The great bath complexes were far more than just places to get clean. They were sprawling community centers with hot and cold pools, steam rooms, gymnasiums for exercise, libraries, and gardens. Here, a man could socialize, network, and relax for hours. The day would often end with an extravagant dinner party or cena featuring exotic dishes and entertainment. For the vast majority of the urban population, life was very different. They were crammed into poorly constructed, multi-story apartment blocks called insulae, which were notorious for being dark, unsanitary, and prone to fires and collapse. A common shopkeeper or artisan would spend his entire day working in a small street-front workshop or taberna. Their diet was simple, based on bread, beans, and vegetables, and their lives were a constant struggle. To keep this vast and often restless urban population from rioting, the emperors developed a famous policy, summarized by the poet Juvenal as panem circenses, bread and circenses. The state provided a dole of free grain to hundreds of thousands of Rome's poorest citizens, and it provided them with spectacular and often brutal free entertainment. The most famous venue for these spectacles was the Colosseum in Rome, the model for amphitheaters across the empire. Here, huge crowds would gather to watch gladiatorial contests, where trained fighters, usually slaves or prisoners of war, fought each other to the death. They also staged elaborate wild beast hunts, pitting exotic animals like lions, elephants, and crocodiles against each other, or against armed men. The other great passion of the Roman masses was chariot racing. At vast stadiums like the Circus Maximus in Rome, which could hold over 150,000 spectators, teams representing different factions, the reds, the whites, the blues, and the greens, would compete in thrilling and dangerous races. The fans were as fanatically devoted to their teams as any modern sports fan, but it's important to remember that this vibrant urban life was the experience of only a small minority. Over 90% of the empire's population lived and worked in the countryside. Their lives were dictated not by the rhythms of the forum or the circus, but by the slow, hard cycle of the agricultural seasons. They were the peasants, tenants, and slaves whose back-breaking labor in the fields and mines produced the wealth upon which the entire glittering edifice of Roman civilization was built. What held this vast and varied world together? The 30-odd professional legions of the Roman army were the ultimate guarantor of the peace, not only defending the thousands of miles of frontiers, but also acting as a force for Romanization, building roads, bridges, and aqueducts. A sophisticated and unified system of Roman law provided a common framework for resolving disputes and conducting business everywhere. The gradual extension of Roman citizenship, which was eventually granted to all free inhabitants of the empire, created a shared legal and political identity. And finally, the imperial cult, the worship of the deceased and sometimes the living emperor as a divine figure, provided a common, unifying religious focus for a world of countless local faiths, a way for everyone to express their loyalty to the Roman state and the peace it provided. The Roman empires at the height of the Pax Romana was a world of cities, roads, and laws, a vast zone of civilization protected by a long, fortified frontier known as the limes. This border, stretching for thousands of miles, was marked by rivers like the Rhine and the Danube, and in places by walls, watchtowers, and forts. It was the line between the Roman world and everything that lay beyond it. But across this line, deep in the misty forests and marshlands of Central and Northern Europe, lived a diverse and formidable collection of peoples whom the Romans viewed with a mixture of contempt, fear, and grudging admiration. These were the Germanic tribes. Like the Celts before them, the peoples the Romans called Germans were not a single unified nation. They were a loose collection of hundreds of independent tribes, the Marcomanni, the Cherusci, the Goths, the Franks, who shared a common family of languages and a similar way of life. Our picture of them is drawn almost entirely from the outside, from the writings of their Roman enemies, most famously the historian Tacitus, in his book Germania. Tacitus painted a portrait of them that was part moralizing lesson for his fellow Romans and part ethnographic study. He saw them as quintessential noble savages, embodying a set of rugged, old-fashioned virtues that he felt the Romans were losing. He admired their towering height, their fierce blue eyes, their incredible bravery in battle, their loyalty, and their strict codes of personal honor and sexual morality. But he also saw them as lazy barbarians, prone to drunkenness and obsessive gambling, who considered farming to be a dishonorable activity best left to women and old men. Germanic society was tribal, rural, and organized for war. They were not city builders. They lived in small villages of wooden longhouses, surrounded by their fields and pastures. Their political life was centered on the assembly of all free warriors, known as the Thing, where the tribe would make its most important decisions, clashing their spears against their shields to signal their approval. The most important social bond was the comitatus, or war band. A charismatic chief would gather around him a retinue of elite young warriors who would swear a personal oath to defend him to the death. In return, he would provide them with feasts, weapons, and the spoils of victory. For a warrior to leave a battle alive when his chief had fallen was a lifetime of disgrace. For many years after the conquest of Gaul, Rome's relationship with these tribes was a mixture of trade, diplomacy, and periodic military campaigns. Augustus, the first emperor, believed it was Rome's destiny to expand its borders to the Elbe River, deep in the heart of Germany. For a time, it seemed he would succeed. Roman legions pushed east of the Rhine, establishing forts and beginning the slow process of turning the new territory into a Roman province. The governor, a general named Publius Quintilius Varus, set about introducing Roman law and taxation, but he had gravely underestimated the Germanic love of freedom and the cunning of one man he believed to be his friend. This man was Arminius, a young nobleman of the Cherusci tribe. Arminius was the perfect embodiment of the complex relationship between Rome and the peoples on its frontier. He had been raised in Rome as a hostage, granted Roman citizenship, taught Latin, and had served with distinctions in the Roman army. Varus trusted him implicitly, making him a key advisor. But Arminius's loyalty lay not with the empire that had honored him, but with the people he had been born to lead. Secretly, he forged a powerful alliance of Germanic tribes, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. In the autumn of 9 AD, that moment came. Arminius brought Varus false reports of a minor tribal rebellion, convincing the governor to march his 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, off the main Roman roads and into the dense, swampy Teutoburg forest to put it down. It was a perfectly laid trap. In the narrow, muddy tracks of the forest, the Roman legions, strung out in a long column miles long, were ambushed. They were unable to form their disciplined battle lines or use their heavy javelins effectively. For 3 terrifying days, the trapped Romans were harassed, surrounded, and cut down in a running battle amidst the torrential autumn rain. The slaughter was almost total. Varus, seeing that all was lost, fell on his sword and committed suicide. All 3 of the legion's sacred eagle standards were captured, a devastating blow to Roman honor. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was one of the most catastrophic and psychologically damaging defeats in Roman history. When news reached Rome, the aging Emperor Augustus was said to have wandered the halls of his palace for months, banging his head against the walls and crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The disaster put a permanent end to Roman ambitions to conquer Germany. The Rhine River became the fixed and heavily fortified frontier of the empire, but the relationship across that frontier was never simple. It was a porous border, a place of constant interaction. Germans traded amber and slaves for Roman wine and luxury goods. And increasingly, Germans would serve in the Roman army as auxiliary troops, learning Roman tactics and discipline. For the next few centuries, this long, tense frontier would be the place where the Roman world and the Germanic world met, a line that would hold for a time, but one that would eventually be breached as the tribes to the north grew stronger and the empire within began to weaken. The Roman Empire was a world of 1,000 faiths. The Pax Romana had created a vast, interconnected marketplace, not just for goods, but for gods and ideas. An Egyptian merchant in London might pray to Isis, a Syrian soldier on the Danube might honor Mithras, and a Greek philosopher in Rome might contemplate the nature of the Stoic cosmos. The official state religion, with its pantheon of familiar gods like Jupiter, Juno, and Mars, was more a matter of patriotic ritual than fervent personal belief. The Romans were generally tolerant of other religions, provided their followers were willing to show respect for the Roman gods and, crucially, participate in the cult of the emperor. Into this bustling, diverse, and spiritually restless world, a new faith would emerge from a small, politically turbulent province on the eastern fringe of the empire. It began not as a grand new religion, but as an obscure sect within one of the empire's most ancient and stubborn monotheistic traditions, Judaism. The Roman province of Judea in the early 1st century AD was a place of deep religious ferment and political tension. For centuries, the Jewish people had lived under foreign rule, clinging fiercely to their unique covenant with their one all-powerful God, Yahweh. Many lived in fervent expectation of a figure foretold by their prophets, the Messiah, a savior or anointed one who would restore the kingdom of Israel and deliver his people from bondage. It was into this charged atmosphere that an itinerant preacher and healer from the northern region of Galilee, a man named Jesus of Nazareth, began his public ministry. From a purely historical perspective, Jesus was a Jewish teacher who, for a few short years, traveled the countryside, gathering a small group of followers. His message, delivered through memorable parables and sermons, was a radical call for spiritual renewal. He spoke of the imminent arrival of the kingdom of God, a kingdom not of earthly power, but of divine justice and peace. He taught a message of love for God and for one's neighbor, of compassion for the poor, the sick, and the outcast. And he challenged what he saw as the hypocrisy of the religious establishment. His growing popularity and his proclamation of a new kingdom, however spiritual its meaning, were seen as a threat by both some local religious authorities and the Roman administration, who were ever wary of potential messianic uprisings. Around the year 30 AD, during the Passover festival in Jerusalem, he was arrested and executed by order of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. He was crucified, a brutal Roman punishment reserved for slaves, pirates, and enemies of the state. For any ordinary messianic movement, this would have been the end. The leader was dead, his followers scattered and terrified. But something extraordinary happened. The followers of Jesus, led by his closest disciples, like the fisherman Peter, came to believe with absolute conviction that he had risen from the dead. This belief in the resurrection transformed them. They now saw Jesus not as a failed prophet, but as the true Messiah, the Christ, from the Greek Christos, meaning anointed one, a divine figure whose death and resurrection had conquered sin and death itself. They began to preach this message, at first only to their fellow Jews in Jerusalem. This new movement, which we call Christianity, was in its earliest days simply a sect within Judaism. The figure who would do more than any other to transform this small Jewish sect into a world religion was a man named Paul of Tarsus. Paul was a Pharisee, a devout and educated Jew who had initially been a zealous persecutor of the new Christian movement. But on the road to Damascus, he had a blinding vision of the resurrected Jesus that changed his life forever. Paul became the faith's most brilliant and energetic apostle. He made a series of epic missionary journeys, traveling thousands of miles across the Roman Empire, from Antioch to Athens, Corinth, and eventually to Rome itself. And he brought with him a radical and revolutionary interpretation of Jesus' message. Paul argued that faith in Jesus Christ was open not just to Jews, but to everyone, the Gentiles or non-Jews. Crucially, he insisted that these Gentile converts did not need to follow Jewish law. They did not need to be circumcised or obey kosher dietary rules to become Christians. This was the decision that broke Christianity out of its Jewish cradle and offered it to the entire Roman world. The new faith spread with surprising speed, especially in the bustling, anonymous cities of the empire. Its appeal was enormous. It offered a personal relationship with a single, loving God who cared for every individual, no matter how humble. It promised eternal life and salvation to anyone who believed, a message of hope that resonated deeply with the poor, with slaves, and with women, all of whom were given a place of dignity within the new communities. These communities, or churches, were tight-knit and provided a powerful sense of belonging and mutual support in the often alienating urban landscape of the empire. And ironically, the very success of the Roman Empire provided the perfect infrastructure for the spread of this new faith. The Roman roads made travel for missionaries like Paul safe and easy, and the common languages of Greek and Latin meant the message could be understood almost everywhere. The Roman authorities at first paid little attention, but as the number of Christians grew, their refusal to participate in the public cults or to offer sacrifice to the emperor was seen as stubbornness, atheism, and political disloyalty. Sporadic, localized persecutions began. According to tradition, both Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome during the reign of the Emperor Nero in the mid-60s AD. For now, Christianity remained a small, often misunderstood, and sometimes persecuted minority faith. But it had laid down deep roots in the soil of the empire, and its quiet, radical message of a kingdom not of this world would continue to spread, posing a profound and growing challenge to the very foundations of Roman civilization. The Pax Romana, that long golden afternoon of the Roman Empire, could not last forever. For 2 centuries, the system created by Augustus had provided an unprecedented era of peace and stability, but beneath the surface, deep structural weaknesses were growing. The empire had come to depend entirely on the military to defend its vast frontiers and to maintain internal order. And eventually, the legions, long accustomed to making and unmaking emperors on the battlefield, turned their power inward, shattering the very peace they were supposed to protect. The murder of the Emperor Severus Alexander in 235 AD by his own troops was the gunshot that started an avalanche. It plunged the Roman world into a half-century of chaos, a period of such intense anarchy and suffering that it has become known as the crisis of the 3rd century. The most immediate and visible symptom of the crisis was a complete breakdown of political stability. The throne of the Caesars became a death sentence. In the 50 years that followed, more than 25 men would claim the title of emperor, and almost all of them would die violently, usually murdered by the same soldiers who had raised them to power. These were the barracks emperors, tough, often low-born generals who were proclaimed emperor by their legions on the frontiers, and who would then immediately march on Rome to legitimize their claim, usually by killing the current occupant. The empire was trapped in a devastating cycle of civil war, its armies fighting not against foreign enemies, but against other Roman armies, draining the state of its manpower and its treasury. While the Romans were busy fighting themselves, the enemies on their frontiers, sensing weakness, struck with a new ferocity. On the northern frontier along the Rhine and Danube rivers, the smaller Germanic tribes we met earlier had begun to coalesce into larger, more formidable, and dangerous confederations. Groups like the Franks and the Alemanni now launched large-scale raids deep into Gaul, while the Goths crossed the Danube, sacking cities in the Balkans and even in Greece. For the first time in centuries, the heartlands of the empire felt the terror of barbarian invasion. In the east, an even more dangerous threat emerged. The old, somewhat decadent Parthian Empire was overthrown and replaced by the aggressive and highly centralized Sasanian Persian Empire. The Sasanian kings saw themselves as the heirs to the ancient Persian glory of Darius and Xerxes, and were determined to drive the Romans out of the Middle East. In a moment of profound and unprecedented humiliation for Rome, the Sasanian king Shapur IV defeated a Roman army and captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle. The Emperor of Rome, the master of the world, died as a prisoner of a foreign king, a psychological blow from which Roman prestige would never fully recover. The crisis was not just military and political, it was a total systemic collapse. The constant civil wars were ruinously expensive, and to pay the soldiers whose loyalty was their only claim to power, the emperors resorted to massively debasing the currency. They minted coins that looked like silver, but were in fact mostly bronze with a thin silver wash. This led to runaway hyperinflation. Savings were wiped out, confidence in the currency evaporated, and the complex empire-wide trade network that was the lifeblood of the economy ground to a halt. As if this were not enough, a devastating pandemic, known as the Plague of Cyprian, swept through the empire. It killed millions, from peasants to emperors, further depleting the supply of soldiers for the army and farmers for the fields. Under the strain of these multiple, interlocking disasters, the empire literally began to break apart. The central government in Rome became so weak that it lost control of its own provinces. In the west, the provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Spain broke away to form their own independent Gallic empire. In the east, the desert city-state of Palmyra, led by its brilliant and ambitious queen, Zenobia, seized control of Egypt and much of the Levant, creating a short-lived Palmyrene empire. The Roman Empire was fractured into 3 pieces, and it seemed on the very brink of complete and irreversible collapse. But just as all seemed lost, the empire's remarkable resilience came to the fore one last time. The recovery was led by a series of tough, no-nonsense soldier emperors from the Balkan province of Illyria, men who had risen through the military ranks and were dedicated to saving the state. The most effective of these was the Emperor Aurelian. In a short but brilliant reign of just 5 years, from 270 to 275 AD, Aurelian worked miracles. He defeated the Goths and drove the Alemanni out of Italy. He then turned his legions on the breakaway empires, reconquering first Zenobia's Palmyra and then the Gallic Empire in the west. He had, against all odds, stitched the Roman world back together, earning him the proud title he stamped on his coins, Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. In a telling sign of the new, dangerous times, he also ordered the construction of a massive new set of defensive walls around the city of Rome itself, a tacit admission that the security of the Pax Romana was well and truly over. The empire had survived, but it was deeply scarred and profoundly changed. The old, easygoing world of the Principate was gone forever. The crisis had burned away the last vestiges of the Augustan system. The Roman world was now a harder, more militarized, and more autocratic place. It was a world in desperate need of a new system, a new ideology, and a ruler with the vision and the ruthlessness to impose it. The restored Roman world that Aurelian had pieced back together was a fragile thing, a state saved from the brink but in desperate need of a new foundation. The man who would provide that new foundation was another tough Illyrian soldier who ascended to the throne in 284 AD. His name was Diocletian, and he was an administrative genius who recognized that the crisis of the 3rd century had not been an accident, but a symptom of a system that was no longer fit for purpose. The empire, he concluded, had become simply too large and too complex for one man to rule alone. His solution was a radical and unprecedented restructuring of the empire itself. He began by formally dividing the Roman world into an eastern and a western half. He would rule the wealthier and more populous East as the senior emperor with the title Augustus. He then appointed a trusted military colleague, Maximian, as the Augustus of the West. But Diocletian went a step further. To solve the fatal problem of succession that had plagued the empire for a century, each Augustus adopted a junior emperor, or Caesar, who would be his heir. This rule of 4, known as the Tetrarchy, created a college of emperors, a team that could respond to multiple crises on different frontiers simultaneously. Power now moved away from the old, venerable capital of Rome, which was too far from the action, to new administrative capitals closer to the frontiers, like Nicomedia in the east and Milan in the west. This was more than just a political reorganization. It was a profound ideological shift. Diocletian completely abandoned the old Augustan pretense of being the princeps, or first citizen. He was not the first among equals. He was an absolute monarch, and he made sure everyone knew it. He adopted the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and introduced elaborate Persian-style court ceremonies. Visitors were now required to prostrate themselves on the ground before him, a ritual that would have horrified an emperor like Augustus. This new, openly autocratic system is known as the Dominate, and it marked the final end of the old republic's lingering traditions. As part of his effort to restore traditional Roman values and unity, Diocletian also unleashed the last and most brutal empire-wide persecution of the Christians, whose refusal to sacrifice to the old gods he saw as an act of treason. Then, in 305 AD, in an act without precedent, Diocletian did what no Roman emperor had ever done before. He voluntarily abdicated the throne and retired to his magnificent palace on the Dalmatian coast to live out his days growing cabbages. Diocletian's carefully planned system for a peaceful succession, however, fell apart almost immediately after he left the stage. The sons of the old emperors felt they had a right to rule, and the empire once again plunged into a complex and bloody series of civil wars. Out of this new round of chaos, one man would eventually rise to supreme power. He was Constantine, the son of one of the original Caesars. Constantine's story and the story of the empire changed forever in the year 312 AD. While marching on Rome to face his rival Maxentius, Constantine, who had until then been a worshipper of the sun god Sol Invictus, had a profound religious experience. As the story is told, on the eve of the decisive battle at the Milvian Bridge, he looked to the sky and saw a vision of a cross of light, or perhaps the Christian symbol of the Chi Rho, and with it the words, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, you will conquer. Convinced that he was now under the protection of the Christian God, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the strange new symbol on their shields. The next day, his army won a crushing victory. Maxentius was drowned in the Tiber, and Constantine entered Rome as the sole ruler of the West. This was the great turning point. The following year, Constantine and his Eastern co-emperor issued the Edict of Milan, a landmark decree that proclaimed official tolerance for all religions throughout the empire and ordered an end to the persecution of Christians. But Constantine went much further than mere tolerance. He became the great patron of his new faith. He poured imperial funds into the construction of magnificent churches like the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He granted legal privileges to bishops and began to place Christians in high offices of state. He even involved himself directly in the theological debates of the Church, presiding over the first great ecumenical council at Nicaea in 325 AD, which sought to unify the Church by establishing a common Orthodox doctrine, the Nicene Creed. Having reunited the entire empire under his sole rule, Constantine made one final, world-altering decision. He decided to build a new capital, a new Rome. He chose the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, a strategic and easily defensible location on the Bosphorus Strait, perfectly positioned between Europe and Asia. He massively expanded and rebuilt the city, filling it with churches, palaces, and a new Senate house. In 330 AD, it was dedicated as Constantinople. This move marked a definitive shift in the empire's center of gravity eastward. The new capital was not just a strategic command center, it was a Christian capital, deliberately founded without the baggage of old Rome's pagan temples and traditions. When Constantine died in 337 AD, he left behind a Roman Empire that had been fundamentally transformed. Diocletian had given it a new autocratic state structure. Constantine had given it a new religious heart and a new capital city. Together, these two powerful emperors had ended the crisis and saved the Roman state, but they had remade it into something that Augustus would barely have recognized: the Christian Roman Empire of late antiquity. Constantine had bequeathed to his sons a Roman world that was officially Christian and ruled from a new capital, but the fundamental problem of the empire's vast, overstretched frontiers remained. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine had given the empire a new lease on life, but the pressure from the Germanic peoples living beyond the Rhine and the Danube had never truly gone away. In fact, the relationship had grown more complex. The Roman army was now heavily dependent on Germanic recruits, so much so that by the late 4th century, the army was largely barbarian in composition and even in its high command. Whole tribes were settled on Roman land as foederati or allies, bound by treaty to defend the frontiers in exchange for land and pay. The line between Roman and barbarian was becoming increasingly blurred. This fragile, tense equilibrium was about to be shattered by the arrival of a new and terrifying force from the depths of Asia. Around the year 370 AD, a nomadic people known as the Huns swept out of the Central Asian steppes and into Eastern Europe. They were a people of the horse, master archers who seemed to live their entire lives in the saddle. Their sudden, violent appearance spread panic among the Gothic tribes who had been living peacefully north of the Danube for generations. Fleeing the Hunnic terror, a huge group of Goths, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, arrived as desperate refugees on the northern bank of the Danube, the frontier of the Eastern Roman Empire. They pleaded with the Roman authorities for permission to cross the river and settle peacefully on Roman land as allies. The Eastern Emperor, Valens, seeing a potential source of new army recruits, agreed. But the operation was a disaster of mismanagement and corruption. Greedy Roman officials stole the food sent to feed the starving refugees, forcing the Goths to sell their own children into slavery in exchange for scraps of dog meat. Humiliated, starving, and stripped of their weapons, the desperate Goths finally rose in a furious rebellion. For 2 years, they rampaged through the Balkans, looting and burning. In the summer of 378 AD, Emperor Valens, overconfident and eager for a glorious victory, marched his main field army to confront them near the city of Adrianople. He attacked rashly without waiting for reinforcements from the Western Emperor. The result was the single most devastating battlefield defeat in Roman history. The Roman heavy infantry was surrounded and annihilated by the Gothic cavalry. 2/3 of the army was destroyed, and Emperor Valens himself was killed on the field. The Battle of Adrianople was a shattering blow. It was not just the loss of an army and an emperor. It was the destruction of the myth of Roman invincibility. It proved that a barbarian army on Roman soil could destroy a Roman emperor and his legions. The dam had broken. The Danube frontier was now permanently open, and the Goths were a hostile, independent power living and moving inside the empire's borders. This event triggered a domino effect. With the northern frontiers weakened, other groups began to push across. The most dramatic of these crossings occurred on the last night of the year 406 AD, when a massive wave of peoples, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi poured across the frozen Rhine River into Gaul, which was from that point on largely lost to Roman control. The Visigoths, the group responsible for the victory at Adrianople, now moved west into Italy under the leadership of a powerful new king, Alaric. Alaric did not necessarily want to destroy the empire, but rather to carve out a secure place for his people within it. After a series of failed negotiations for land and gold, he marched his army on the city of Rome itself. In the year 410, his forces entered and sacked the city. For 3 days, the Visigoths looted the ancient capital. The physical damage was not catastrophic, but the psychological shock that reverberated around the Mediterranean world was immense. The Eternal City, the sacred center of the empire for 800 years, had fallen to a barbarian army. The event prompted the great theologian, St. Augustine of Hippo, to write his masterpiece, The City of God, to explain how the earthly city could fall while the city of God remained eternal. The chaos was amplified by the continued presence of the Huns, who under their most famous and feared leader, Attila, had forged a vast, short-lived empire in Central Europe. In 451, Attila invaded Gaul, where he was met by a Roman army commanded by the general Aetius that was itself composed almost entirely of allied barbarians, including a large contingent of Visigoths. At the bloody battle of the Catalonian plains, Attila was fought to a standstill in one of the last great imperial actions in the West. He invaded Italy the following year, but turned back from sacking Rome, supposedly after a meeting with Pope Leo the Great. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a hollow shell. Independent Germanic kingdoms had been established in its former provinces. The Visigoths were in Spain, the Vandals had crossed the sea and taken the crucial province of North Africa, and the Franks and Burgundians were settling into Gaul. In 455, the Vandals sailed from their African kingdom and subjected Rome to a second, far more destructive sack. The emperor in the west was now a powerless figure, a puppet controlled by a series of powerful barbarian generals. The once mighty empire had been carved up, its authority had evaporated, and all that remained was for the final, symbolic act to take place. By the 470s, the Roman Empire in the West was a ghost of its former self, a hollowed-out political fiction. The real power was no longer held by the emperor in his palace at Ravenna, but by the supreme commander of the army, the Magister Militum, a position almost always held by a powerful Germanic general. For several decades, a series of these barbarian warlords, men like the formidable Ricimer, acted as the true masters of Italy, appointing and deposing a sad succession of weak and ephemeral puppet emperors. The empire itself had shrunk to little more than the Italian peninsula and a few scattered, isolated holdings. The rich provinces of Gaul, Spain, and North Africa were now independent Germanic kingdoms in all but name. The end, when it came, was not a dramatic, fiery cataclysm, but a quiet, almost weary final sigh. In the year 475, a Roman general named Orestes drove out the current emperor and, in a final act of dynastic ambition, placed his own young son on the imperial throne. The boy's name was Romulus, and he was given the grand title of Augustus. But he was so young and insignificant that he was known to everyone by the diminutive nickname Romulus Augustulus, or Little Augustus. In a moment of supreme and tragic irony, the last emperor of the West bore the names of both the mythical founder of the city and its first great emperor, his own name, a faint echo of the grand thousand-year story that was now drawing to a close. The Roman army in Italy at this point was a patchwork of Germanic mercenaries, mostly Heruli, Syrians, and Rugians. They had been promised land in Italy in exchange for their service, a promise Orestes refused to honor. The disgruntled army mutinied. They proclaimed their own commander, a powerful Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, as their king. Odoacer marched on Ravenna, captured and executed Orestes, and then dealt with the boy emperor. On September 4th, 476 A.D., Odoacer's soldiers entered the palace and deposed the young Romulus Augustulus. But there was no dramatic execution. Odoacer, perhaps seeing the boy as no threat, simply sent him into a comfortable retirement in a villa near Naples, and he disappears from the historical record. For the people living at the time, this event was not the world-shattering cataclysm that later ages would make it. Odoacer did not proclaim himself emperor. Instead, in a shrewd political move, he gathered the imperial regalia of the West, the diadem, the purple robes, and the scepter, and sent them to the Eastern Roman Emperor, Zeno, in Constantinople. The accompanying message from the remaining Roman Senate declared that the world no longer needed two emperors, and that one, in Constantinople, was sufficient for all. Odoacer would rule Italy as the king of his people, theoretically acting as the viceroy of the distant emperor in the East. For the average person in Rome, life went on much as it had before. The Senate still met, the consuls were still appointed, but the unbroken line of emperors who had ruled the West for 500 years was now at an end. This quiet, almost administrative event is the date later historians would choose to mark the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire and with it, the end of antiquity. Why did it fall? There is no simple answer. For centuries, historians have debated the causes, and the truth is that it was not a single event, but a long, slow process of transformation and decay, a death by 1,000 cuts. It was the relentless, centuries-long pressure of migrating peoples on a frontier that was simply too long to effectively defend. It was the internal political cancer of endless civil wars, which drained the state of its best men and its treasure. It was the economic exhaustion, the debased currency, and the collapse of the complex trade networks that had sustained the cities. It was the social stratification, the vast gulf between the enormously wealthy and the masses of the poor. It was the over-reliance on barbarian soldiers who, in the end, had little loyalty to the Roman state they were paid to defend. It is crucial to remember, as our long story closes, that it was only the western half of the empire that fell. In the east, the Roman Empire, centered on its magnificent and impregnable capital of Constantinople, not only survived, but thrived. This Eastern Roman, or Byzantine Empire, as we now call it, would continue to be a major power for another 1,000 years, preserving the legacy of Roman law and Greek culture long after the West had fragmented. In the West, the collapse of central imperial authority gave way to a new, decentralized world. A patchwork of Germanic successor kingdoms now ruled the former provinces: the Franks in Gaul, the Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in Africa, and later the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. The great unified world of the Pax Romana was gone, replaced by a smaller scale, more rural, and politically fractured Europe. And so the ancient world quietly fades, like a grand and lingering sunset. The legions are gone, the aqueducts are crumbling, and the emperors are but a memory. Yet the legacy of this incredible civilization endures. It lives on in the great Romance languages, French as Spanish, Italian, all born from the Latin of the Roman soldier and the peasant. It lives on in the principles of Roman law, which still form the bedrock of many legal systems today. And it lived on, most powerfully, through the Roman Catholic Church, which adopted the empire's administrative structure and became the great preserver of classical learning and the Latin language through the centuries that would follow. The body of the empire was gone, but its spirit, transformed and adapted, would continue to shape the destiny of the new Europe that was slowly, painfully being born from its ruins. Now, as our journey through this long and epic story comes to its end, just let the final images fade. The story is told. The great cities and the grand armies have all turned to dust, their clamor and their glory now just a quiet echo. There is nothing left to do now but rest. Let the silence of history settle around you, as deep and as peaceful as a sleeping forest. And as you drift off, may your dreams be calm and your rest be deep.